When I stepped into the lobby of my son's company, he laughed out loud. I was wearing my old navy blue dress, a faded coat, and the worn leather shoes I had polished myself that morning. Ethan looked me up and down from head to toe right in front of his employees, a sneer spreading across his face. "Mom, do you have any idea how embarrassing this is?" Vanessa covered her mouth, but I could still see her smirking. A few people turned away while others began to whisper. Standing under that gleaming corporate logo, clutching the small gift I had brought for my son, I felt something inside me break. But Ethan didn't know the truth. The company he worshipped so much never really belonged to him. What would you do if your own flesh and blood humiliated you like this? Let me know in the comments. If this story touches your heart, please like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I live in a small white house on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. It's the kind of house people drive by without a second glance. The paint on the porch railing is peeling, and the kitchen floor creaks near the sink. In the winter, the cold wind slips through the cracks of the old windows, no matter how many towels I stuff under the frames. But it's clean, it's quiet, and every corner holds a memory. My name is Leela Alexander. I'm 68 years old and I'm a widow. In my son's eyes, I never understood how to look like a success. I still clip coupons from the Sunday paper, buy coats from the clearance rack, and darn socks instead of throwing them away. If a lamp breaks, I fix the wiring myself. If a chair leg wobbles, I tighten the screws. I lived through too many lean years to start throwing money around just because we have it. That is something Ethan could never understand. To him, money was meant to be flash. To me, money was a roof over our heads. My son, Ethan Alexander, lives in a glass penthouse in Manhattan and runs Alexander Global Solutions, a firm highly praised in business magazines. His face appears on conference banners, investor brochures, and in glossy interviews where he talks about vision, discipline, and legacy. He inherited my husband Robert's last name, his sharp jawline, and my stubbornness. But somewhere along the way, he lost the kindness he used to have. When Ethan was little, he used to hold my hand so tightly when crossing the street that my fingers would ache. He would fall asleep at the kitchen table while I folded laundry past midnight. Sometimes, when I came home from a late shift at the diner, he would wake up groggy and whisper, "Mom, did you eat?" Most nights I lied, "Yes, baby, I ate." The truth was, the medical bills from the 6 months before Robert passed away nearly broke us. Ethan was only 12 then, too young to understand why I sold my wedding bracelet, but old enough to notice the pale mark it left on my wrist. "Where did your bracelet go?" he asked one morning. I kissed his forehead and told him I put it in a safe place. In a way, it was the truth. I turned it into his tuition, food on the table, and electricity to keep the lights on. Years later, when Ethan got into college, I cried in a grocery store parking lot because I didn't want him to see how scared I was. Tuition, books, housing, everything cost more than I had. But through overtime, loans, and the help Robert had quietly set aside before he passed, Ethan went to school. He promised me he would never forget. "One day, Mom," he said, hugging me tightly before freshman orientation, "I'm going to take care of you. You'll never have to work again." I believed him. A mother believes a lot of things when they come from her child. For a while, Ethan called every Sunday night like clockwork. He told me about his classes, his internships, his first job, his first promotion. I kept every photo he sent. I framed his graduation picture and put it on the mantel right next to Robert's. Then the calls grew shorter. Next it was once a month, then just text messages. "Busy week, Mom, talk soon." "In a board meeting, call you later." "Traveling for work, hope you're well." I was always well because I didn't want to be a burden. When he married Vanessa, I tried to welcome her with an open heart. She was flawless, the way expensive women usually are, smooth hair, perfect nails, and a smile that looked practiced in a mirror. At the wedding, she brushed her cheek against mine and said, "Leela, we're so glad you could make it." Not Mom, not even Mrs. Alexander, just Leela. I told myself not to be sensitive, but I noticed the details. I noticed how Vanessa's eyes lingered on my dress, pausing at the cuffs I had hemmed myself. I noticed how she guided the photographer away from me. I noticed how Ethan introduced Vanessa's parents to New York investors, board members, and friends, while I was placed at a table near the back with distant cousins I barely knew. But I kept smiling. It was my son's wedding day. I wouldn't ruin it with hurt feelings. After that, Ethan grew distant even faster. He stopped inviting me to company dinners. When I asked about visiting him in New York, He said the city was too exhausting and that I wouldn't like it. When I mailed homemade cookies to his office, Vanessa called later, her voice sweet but sharp enough to cut, telling me that executives usually didn't accept food and that they don't reuse cookie tins. I just laughed softly when she said it, pretending I didn't catch the insult, but I did. I understood every word people think an elderly mother is too slow to notice. One Thanksgiving, Ethan and Vanessa came back to Ohio for less than 3 hours. Inside the house, Vanessa didn't even take off her coat. Ethan stood in my kitchen and looked around with an expression like he had walked into a museum he had spent his life escaping. "You still have this table?" he asked. There was no warmth of memory in his voice, only embarrassment. "This table raised you," I said quietly. He let out a short laugh. "Mom, sometimes the things you say are just too dramatic." Vanessa smiled into her coffee. I looked down at my hands. They were older now, the veins more prominent, the knuckles swollen from years of work. These were the hands that had made his lunches, signed his school forms, smoothed his hair when he had a fever, scrubbed the floors, folded his uniforms, and signed the checks for his education. Dramatic? No, just facts. But I didn't argue. That was another thing a mother learns. Silence keeps a visit from becoming a final goodbye. For years, I let Ethan believe I was just a simple old woman living on careful habits and memories. I let him believe that the company was entirely his world, his kingdom, his achievement. When he talked about ownership, as if the name Alexander belonged to him alone, I never corrected him. Long before Ethan was old enough to understand, Robert and I had made choices, decisions involving shares, trusts, signatures, and protective clauses. Robert was a quiet man, but he was far from foolish. Before he passed, he made sure certain things could not be taken away, squandered, or exploited by a young man who hadn't yet built the character to handle them. Those documents were locked in a metal box under my bed. I rarely opened it, not because I forgot what was inside, but because I hoped I would never need to use it. Until a grey afternoon in early October, when I walked back from the mailbox with a stack of bills, grocery coupons, and a thick beige envelope. The return address made my breath catch: Alexander Global Solutions. For a moment, I just stood on the porch, letting the cold wind pull at the edges of my faded sweater. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was an invitation printed on heavy cardstock. The company was celebrating its 20th anniversary in New York City. Investors, board members, executives, and the press would be there. And at the very bottom, in formal print, was my name, Mrs. Leela Alexander. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on the porch steps, pressing the invitation to my chest. Maybe Ethan wanted me there. Maybe after all these years of distance, he finally remembered. Maybe my son was ready to stand beside his mother without shame. For the first time in a long time, I let myself hope. And at my age, hope can be a dangerous thing. For the next 2 days, I carried that invitation around the house as if it were a fragile treasure. I set it on the kitchen table while I made tea, then moved it to the mantel next to Robert's photo. Before turning off the lights at night, I would read it one more time, tracing my name with a finger. Mrs. Leela Alexander. It had been so long since anything from Ethan's world included me so formally, so publicly. Deep down, I knew better than to let my heart run away with me. But mothers are foolish in that way. We can be hurt 100 times, but the moment a child makes one small gesture, we believe all wounds can heal. I began to prepare as if I had been invited to the White House. The first thing I did was open the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were the old items I rarely touched: Robert's old wool scarf, Ethan's baby blanket, a stack of birthday cards tied with ribbon, and a navy blue dress carefully folded in tissue paper. It wasn't expensive, it never had been, but Robert had loved that dress. "You look most like yourself in that," he had told me once, watching me pin up my hair from across the bedroom with a smile. Strong, elegant, like a woman who doesn't need diamonds to shine. I held the dress to my chest and closed my eyes. "Oh, Robert," I whispered, "I wish you were here to tell me if I'm being foolish." The house answered with silence. I spent the morning polishing my leather shoes, even though the leather had grown soft and wrinkled with time. I rubbed them until they shone, until I could faintly see the reflection of my own face. Then, I took my faded coat from the closet and brushed it carefully. One button was loose, so I secured it tightly with navy thread. It's amazing how much hope can be packed into small, ordinary tasks. That afternoon, I took the bus downtown to buy a gift for Ethan. I could have ordered something expensive. I could have sent a watch, a rare bottle of wine, or framed art. But Ethan already had too many expensive things. His life was crowded with them. I wanted to give him something that would remind him of who he used to be. In a small antique shop near the courthouse, I found a silver compass in a glass case. It was old but well preserved, with tiny scratches on the lid. When the shopkeeper opened it for me, the needle trembled and then pointed firmly north. My husband used to say a man needs direction more than he needs praise, I told her. She smiled. Sounds like he was a very wise man. He was. I bought the compass and asked her to wrap it in brown paper. On the card I wrote just one sentence. When the noise of success is deafening, remember where home is. I kept the package on my lap during the bus ride back, imagining Ethan opening it. Maybe he would laugh softly. Maybe he would remember the boy who used to ask Robert how sailors found their way back. Maybe, just for a second, my son would look at me without impatience in his eyes. That night Ethan called. His name appeared on my screen, and before I could stop myself, my spirits lifted. "Hi, baby," I said. "Mom," he answered quickly, "you got the invitation, right?" "I did, it's very beautiful." "Good, the event starts at 7, but you should be there by 6:30. Security will have your name and I'll be there." There was a pause on the line, but not a warm one. I could hear background noise, glasses clinking, someone laughing. "And Mom, it's a formal event, there will be press there, investors too." "I understand. I'm just saying it's important." The words themselves weren't cruel, but his tone made them heavy. "I know how to behave at a dinner, Ethan," I said gently. He sighed. "That's not what I meant," but it was exactly what he meant. I looked down at the wrapped compass on the table. "I'm looking forward to seeing you." "Right, me too, I have to go. Vanessa and I are having dinner with the Whitmore group." Before I could say goodbye, the line went dead. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Less than 10 minutes later, Vanessa called. That surprised me. Vanessa almost never called unless something needed to be corrected, cancelled, or kept quiet. "Hello, Vanessa," I said. Leela, her voice was smooth, like polished marble. "I just wanted to make sure you're all set for Saturday." All set, not looking forward to it, not welcome, just all set. How thoughtful, I said. "I think I can manage." A soft chuckle came through the line. "Of course, it's just a very high-profile night for Ethan. A lot of important people, board members, investors, probably media." So Ethan mentioned. "Yes." "Well," she paused, "I know you're comfortable with your style, and it's very sweet for Ohio. But New York can be demanding." I looked at the hallway mirror, at my reflection in the old cardigan and house slippers. "I'm not going to New York to please anyone," I said. Another pause. "No, but Ethan is," Vanessa replied. "And as his mother, I'm sure you'd want to support him." The sharp edge wrapped in silk finally showed itself. I kept my voice level. "I've supported Ethan my entire life." "I'm sure you have," she said, though her tone told me she had no interest in the truth of that statement. "It's just maybe avoid telling too many old stories. You know about the lean years. People can misinterpret. Misinterpret what? Well, Ethan has worked very hard to build a specific image. We wouldn't want people thinking he came from," she trailed off. "From struggle." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because this woman, who lived on the worth of the name Alexander, was ashamed of the very hardships that made the name mean anything at all. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. "Wonderful, see you Saturday." The house felt colder after she hung up. I walked to the fireplace and looked at the photo of Robert standing next to a young Ethan, both holding fishing rods and smiling into the sun. Robert's hand was on Ethan's shoulder, like he was anchoring him to the earth. "They are ashamed of where they came from," I whispered. Robert's smile didn't change. Later that evening, just as I was about to fold the navy dress into a garment bag, my phone rang again. This time the screen showed a name I hadn't seen in months, Daniel Brooks. My hand tightened on the phone before answering. "Daniel." "Leela," he said, his voice bearing the careful weight of a man who never spoke without purpose. "I heard you received an invitation." "Yes." "Do you plan to attend?" "Yes." Silence stretched between us. Then Daniel said, "Are you sure you're ready to face him in that building?" I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed. That building, not the event, not the company, but that building. Daniel knew what those words meant better than anyone. "I'm going as his mother," I said. "I understand," he replied, "but some truths have a way of entering a room whether we invite them or not." My eyes drifted to the closet. Behind a row of old coats beneath a folded quilt sat the locked metal box Robert had left me. Inside were documents Ethan had never seen, papers with signatures, seals, shares, trust agreements, and instructions written in Robert's firm, slanted handwriting. For years Daniel had advised me to prepare. For years I had refused. "He's not ready," I whispered. Daniel took a slow breath. "Leela, with all due respect, if someone doesn't face who they've become, they may never be ready." The words hurt because they were true. I stood up and opened the closet. My knees ached as I bent down to pull the metal box from beneath the quilt. Dust clung to the lid. The small brass lock caught the light. For a moment I could almost hear Robert's voice. "Protect him, Leela, but don't protect him so much that you stop him from becoming a real man." "I don't want to bring shame to my son," I whispered. "No," Daniel said softly, "but you might need to stop letting him bring shame to you." I closed my eyes. In my mind, I saw Ethan as a little boy running into my arms with a scraped knee. Then I saw him in a tailored suit, looking at my old coat like it was a stain on his life. "I'll go to New York," I finally said, "but the papers stay here. For now," I placed my hand on the cold metal box. "For now." After hanging up, I sat in the bedroom alone for a long time. The navy dress hung on the closet door, the compass sat quietly on the table, and the invitation lay next to Robert's photo. Hope was still there, but now, beneath it, something else began to shift. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet awareness that comes when a woman has been underestimated for far too long. On Saturday morning, I woke up before sunrise. I lay still under the blankets for a few minutes, listening to the old house breathe around me. The pipes in the walls gave a faint click. A truck rumbled down a distant road. The sky outside my bedroom window was grey, not yet fully awake. I turned my head to look at the navy blue dress hanging on the closet door. It looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe it was just that I had carried so many more years since I last wore it. I got out of bed slowly, my knees stiff and my back aching. Age has a familiar way of reminding you it has taken up permanent residence in your body. I made coffee, toasted a single slice of bread, and stood by the kitchen counter instead of sitting down to eat. I was too restless to sit. The invitation lay right next to my mug. Alexander Global Solutions, 20th Anniversary Gala, New York City. I read the words again, trying to steady the flutter in my chest. "It's just a dinner," I whispered to myself. But it was. It was my son's world. A world of glass towers, private cars, and polished shoes, where people measured value by things that glittered. I had never belonged there, not because I couldn't, but because I never wanted to live in an illusion that money made a person better than anyone else. After breakfast, I took my time getting ready. I showered, combed my silver hair back into a soft bun, and secured it carefully with pins. My hands shook slightly as I opened the garment bag. The navy dress slipped over my arms, the old fabric rustling. It was simple, with long sleeves and a modest neckline. Near the hem, there was a tiny, neat repair where I had once caught it on a chair. I ran my thumb over the stitches, smiling with a tinge of sadness. Robert had noticed it the night I mended it. "You fixed that so beautifully," he had said. "I didn't want to throw it away." He had taken my hand and kissed my knuckles. "That's why I love you, Leela. You see the value in things people are too quick to discard." I stood in front of the mirror, hearing his voice now as clearly as if he were standing behind me. The woman looking back wasn't glamorous. Her face had lines, her hands were rough, her dress was old, but her eyes were steady. I put on a pair of small pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. They weren't real pearls. He had apologized when he gave them to me, embarrassed that he couldn't afford better. I had worn them with pride ever since. By 10 o'clock, Ethan's black SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched it through the front window, feeling a surge of affection before reality pulled my heart back down. Ethan got out first. He wore a dark, custom suit, his hair perfectly styled, his phone already in hand. Vanessa followed, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Her cream coat was draped over her shoulders, looking like she had stepped off a runway. I opened the door before they could knock. "Hi, baby," I said. Ethan looked up. For a fraction of a second, I saw a glimpse of my little boy. Then his eyes swept over me and the warmth vanished. Mom, he said carefully, you're wearing that. I looked down at my dress. Yes, I think it's very nice. Vanessa lowered her sunglasses slowly. Her smile was forced. Oh, Leela, just 2 words, but they carried a roomful of judgment. I stepped back to let them in. Would you like some coffee before we leave? No, Ethan said quickly. We're on a tight schedule. We're not late, Vanessa corrected gently, her eyes still on my dress, but we might need to make a quick stop on the way. I knew what she meant before she even said it. There's a boutique near the highway, she continued. Very tasteful. We could find something a bit more suitable. Suitable for whom? I asked. Vanessa blinked. Ethan let out a sigh. Mom, please don't make this difficult. I'm not making it difficult. This isn't a church luncheon in Ohio, he said. This is a major corporate event in Manhattan. There will be press, investors, high-profile people. High-profile people. I felt the sting of those words, small but sharp. I see, I said. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I just need tonight to go perfectly, and your dress is going to distract from that. Vanessa gave a soft chuckle. It's not just the dress, it's the overall impression. Ethan has worked very hard to project a certain image. I looked at my son, and I don't fit that image. He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. I turned and went to the table, picking up the small, wrapped compass. I brought a gift for you. Ethan glanced at it distractedly. Mom, you didn't have to do that. I wanted to. He took it but didn't open it, handing it instead to Vanessa. She slipped it into her designer bag as if it were an inconvenience. Something tightened in my chest, not because of the gift but because of their casual dismissal. A compass that had taken me an hour to choose and a lifetime to understand. We locked up and walked to the SUV. Ethan opened the back door for me, pausing as if the courtesy cost him something. I climbed in, smoothing my dress over my knees. The drive to the airport was quiet at first. I watched the tinted Ohio landscape blur past the window, gas stations, bare trees, small houses, fields sleeping under a pale sky. These were places Ethan used to know, but now he spoke of them as if they were a childhood illness he had recovered from. Vanessa typed on her phone. Ethan took 2 calls, his mouth full of words like valuations, optics, expansion, and board confidence. His voice changed when he spoke to business people. It became lower, smoother, more important. When he finished the second call, he turned slightly in his seat. Mom, I need you to keep things simple tonight. I looked at the back of his head. Simple, all right. If anyone asks about you, just say you're proud of me. Keep it brief. I didn't plan on giving a speech. I know, but sometimes you get sentimental, Vanessa added without looking up. And maybe avoid mentioning the diner days. Some people romanticize the struggle, but others see it as instability. Ethan seemed relieved. That hurt more than if he had argued with me directly. At the airport he moved fast, checking us in, guiding Vanessa through security and speaking to me in short commands. Put your bag there. Shoes off, Mom. No, not that line, this one. I followed in silence. On the plane, I took the window seat while Ethan and Vanessa discussed the seating chart for the dinner. I heard names I didn't know, investors, board members, journalists. Charles Whitmore's name came up twice. Charles is going to be watching everything tonight, Vanessa said. He always watches everything, Ethan replied. That's why I need the family angle to look clean. The family angle. I turned to the clouds outside the window. Not a mother, not a history, not love, just an angle. By the time we reached New York, the sun had dropped behind the skyline. The city rose up in steel and glass, loud, bright, and impatient. Ethan's driver took us through traffic toward the venue. I hadn't changed into anything else because I didn't have anything else to change into. Vanessa tried one more time. Leela, I can truly have something sent up to the room. A simple black dress, nothing dramatic. I looked at her reflection in the window. This dress belongs to a happier time in my life. Her expression softened for a fraction of a second, before turning cold again. Sentimentality doesn't always translate well in public. No, I said quietly, I suppose it doesn't. Ethan looked at his watch. Let's not argue about this anymore. I wanted to ask him when I had become something to be managed. I wanted to ask him if he remembered crying into my apron when he was 10 because he had torn his only good shirt before picture day. I had stayed up past midnight to fix it. The next morning, he had hugged me so tight I almost dropped the iron. But I said nothing, because the closer we got to his world, the smaller he wanted me to be. At the hotel, right before entering the ballroom, Ethan gave me one last warning. "Mom," he said, keeping his voice down, "please stay near our table. Don't wander around. If someone important approaches, let me handle the conversation." I looked at him for a long moment. "Do I embarrass you that much?" His jaw tightened. "Don't make this emotional." In that moment I understood. He didn't want me there as his mother. He wanted me there as proof that he had won. I nodded slowly. "All right, Ethan." He relaxed slightly. Vanessa adjusted his tie, smiled at him and said, "Tonight is too important for mistakes." I followed them toward the ballroom doors, my old leather shoes making a soft sound against the marble, my neatly wrapped hope already unraveling. But somewhere deep down, I still prayed my son would remember who I was before the night ended. The ballroom looked like it had been taken from a world I only saw in magazines. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain overhead. High windows reflected the Manhattan skyline, every building glittering against the darkening sky. White roses sat in silver vases on every table. Waiters moved silently among the guests with trays of champagne. Everywhere I looked, people were polished, expensive, and entirely sure they belonged there. I stood at the entrance, my hands clutching my small purse. For a second I forgot to breathe. Ethan stepped forward as if the room had been waiting for him. His shoulders went back, and a wide, confident smile appeared on his face instantly, the kind of smile he never brought to my kitchen table anymore. "Ethan," a man called from across the room. My son raised a hand. "Martin, good to see you." Vanessa took his arm and together they moved into the crowd like royalty entering a court. I followed a few steps behind, not beside them but behind. The gap was small but I could feel it clearly. At first I tried to stay close. Ethan introduced Vanessa to investors, board members, and people whose names I forgot as soon as I heard them because I was so nervous. But every time I stepped near, Vanessa would shift slightly, placing herself between me and the conversation. At one point, Ethan looked back and said, "Mom, why don't you find our table? We'll be right over." His voice was polite, his eyes were not, so I nodded and walked away. The place cards were set near the center of the room. I saw my name printed in elegant black ink, Mrs. Leela Alexander. Seeing it there made my throat tighten for some reason. I touched the card lightly and sat down. Around me, people laughed and talked in smooth, confident voices. They discussed summer homes, market trends, private schools, charity boards, and restaurants, where a single meal cost more than my monthly grocery bill. No one spoke to me. I was used to being invisible in certain places. Women my age often are. People look right through us as if our stories ended the moment our hair turned grey. But tonight the invisibility felt different. It felt arranged. After a few minutes I stood up and walked to the side of the ballroom, where framed photographs showing the company's history were displayed. There were pictures of offices opening, product launches, ribbon cuttings, leadership retreats. Ethan was in many of them, smiling in his suits, shaking hands, standing in front of banners with the name Alexander. I stopped at the very end, in front of an older photograph. It showed the first small office building the company had used 20 years ago. I recognized it. Robert had taken me there once when the paint was still fresh on the walls and the desks were second-hand. He had been so proud that day, even though he tried to hide it. "This could turn into a real business," he had said to me. "It already is," I answered. He had squeezed my hand tight. "Only because you believed it before anyone else did." I stared at the picture until my vision blurred. "Ma'am." I turned. A young woman in a black uniform was standing next to me, holding a tray of water glasses. She had kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Can I get you anything?" The kindness took me by surprise and I almost cried. "No, thank you, dear," I said. "I'm fine." She glanced at my name tag, Mrs. Alexander. "Yes." Her expression changed to polite recognition. "Oh, you're Mr. Alexander's mother." "I am, that's wonderful," she said. "You must be very proud." I looked across the room at Ethan, surrounded by men in dark suits and women with diamonds. "Yes," I said softly, "I've always been proud." Before she could answer, Ethan's voice came from behind me. "Mom." I turned. He was walking quickly toward us, Vanessa at his side. The smile was still on his face, but it looked stiff now, tight with annoyance. "What are you doing over here?" he asked. I was looking at the pictures. His eyes moved between the young staff member, my dress, and a few guests nearby who were starting to notice us. "You shouldn't be standing right next to the service area," he said, keeping his voice low. I didn't realize it was a service area. Vanessa let out a small laugh, the kind that tries to make cruelty sound harmless. "Leela, this is why we asked you to stay at the table." The young woman lowered her eyes and stepped back. I felt the heat rise to my face. "I was just looking at the history," I said. Ethan's jaw was set. "Mom, tonight is not the time for you to wander around like you're on a museum tour." A man nearby gave a quiet laugh. I heard it. Ethan heard it too, and something shifted in him. He seemed to realize he had an audience. Instead of softening, he leaned into it. He gave a short laugh, turning slightly toward the guests. "My mother still thinks every event is a church basement potluck," he said. A few people gave uncertain smiles. Vanessa touched his arm, but she didn't stop him. Ethan looked me up and down. His eyes lingered on my old navy blue dress, the faded coat over my arm, and my polished but worn shoes. "Mom," he said, his voice a little louder, "you look like you got lost on the way to a thrift store." The words hit the room before they hit me. A ripple of laughter followed. Not everyone was laughing and not every mouth was cruel, but it was enough. Enough to make my dignity feel thin. Enough to make the chandeliers feel suddenly bright and harsh. Enough to make me feel, for one terrible second, like that poor young widow standing in the grocery line again, praying her card wouldn't be declined. I gripped my purse tightly. "Ethan," I whispered. But he didn't stop. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he thought making me small made him look larger. "My mother has never believed in branding," he said to the guests, smiling as if it were a charming story. "She dresses like we're broke." Maury laughter. Vanessa looked down, hiding her smile behind her champagne glass. That hurt almost as much as Ethan's words, because she knew he was humiliating me and she let it happen. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The expensive suit, the shiny watch, the perfect hair. This was the man who used to cry into my apron when boys at school teased him for wearing discount sneakers. I had held him then. I told him his worth wasn't in his shoes, and now he was using the exact same measure on me. A few feet away, someone raised a phone. I saw the screen point toward us. Another person turned to whisper to the woman beside him. The young woman who had offered me water stood frozen against the wall, her face full of pity. Pity. I had survived hunger, debt, grief, widowhood, and loneliness, but the shame my son brought me earned me a pity that almost broke me. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say, "Do you know what this dress means? Do you know what these hands paid for? Do you know whose name built the floor you're standing on?" But I didn't. It wasn't time. Instead, I stood quietly under the golden lights, letting the silence stretch around us. Ethan seemed uneasy with the quiet. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice dropping again. "Don't look like that, it was just a joke." A joke. Cruelty is often called a joke when people realize the wound is visible. I nodded, though not because I agreed. "I understand," I said. My voice was calm, perhaps too calm. For the first time that night, Ethan's confidence flickered. Before he could say anything else, a deep voice came from behind him. "Mrs. Alexander." The air in the room seemed to turn over. Ethan spun around. An older gentleman in a charcoal suit stood a few steps away. He was tall, with silver hair and an undeniable presence. I recognized him instantly, even though we hadn't seen each other in years. Charles Whitmore, the chairman of the board. His eyes weren't on Ethan. He was looking at me. There was no embarrassment in his gaze, only recognition, respect, and something close to alarm. He stepped forward slowly, as if he were approaching someone important enough to quiet the entire room. "Mrs. Alexander," he said again, his voice much warmer this time. "I didn't know you had arrived." Ethan's face tightened with confusion. Vanessa's smile vanished. Charles reached out, taking my hand in both of his with a gentle grip. "It is an honor to have you here," he said. The people who had been laughing a moment ago went quiet. Monica Reed, the head of HR, stood near the bar, watching. I saw her eyes move from Charles's respectful stance to Ethan's stunned face, and then back to me. She understood immediately that something was wrong. Ethan gave a nervous laugh. "Charles, you know my mother." Charles did not look amused. He kept his eyes on me for a second longer before turning to my son. "Ethan," he said quietly, Do you have any idea who you just humiliated? The noise of the ballroom seemed to disappear completely. My son stared at him, both confused and annoyed. I kept my eyes on the floor, feeling the old navy cloth against my knees, feeling the weight of the years. And for the first time that night, I realized the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. For one long second, nobody moved. Charles Whitmore stood in front of me, holding my hand with both of his, as if I were someone of great importance rather than an old woman in faded clothes. Ethan looked from Charles to me and back again. What do you mean? My son whispered. She's my mother. Charles's face was calm, but there was iron underneath. Yes, Ethan, she is your mother. The way he said it made Ethan's jaw tighten. Vanessa took a step closer, forcing a smaller, more cautious smile back onto her face. Charles, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Ethan was just joking with Leela. Charles looked at her, not rudely but with something worse, indifference. I heard well enough to understand exactly what that joke was, he said. Vanessa's face went bright red. I gently pulled my hand from Charles's grip. Please, I whispered. Not here. Charles instantly turned to me. Of course, Mrs. Alexander. Mrs. Alexander, not Leela, not Ethan's mother, just Mrs. Alexander. The entire room seemed to feel the weight of that name. Ethan felt it too. He narrowed his eyes. Charles, why are you calling her that? Before Charles could answer, Daniel Brooks appeared at the edge of the crowd. He had always been a quiet man, tall, thin, with silver-rimmed glasses, and an aura that allowed him to enter a room without asking for permission. He wore a dark suit, holding a leather folder under his arm. When I saw him, my stomach tightened. Daniel wasn't supposed to be here, or deep down maybe I knew he would come all along. Leela, he called softly. Daniel. Ethan snapped his head around. Even you know him. Daniel's gaze fell on Ethan, carrying a sadness older than the night itself. I've known your family for nearly 30 years. My family, Ethan repeated. You mean my mother? I mean your family, Daniel said. Vanessa shifted beside Ethan. Ethan, maybe we shouldn't discuss this in front of everyone. It was the first sensible thing she had said all evening. Charles glanced at Monica Reed, who had been watching from near the bar. Monica, could you please help guide the guests to the exhibit area? Tell them we'll begin in 10 minutes. Monica nodded immediately. Of course. She moved with professional grace, drawing attention away from us. The music swelled slightly, and the waiters began to move again. Conversation resumed, but it was forced. People still looked over their shoulders at us every now and then. A room that had been laughing at me just minutes ago was now desperate to know why the chairman of the board looked ready to defend me. Charles leaned in slightly. Mrs. Alexander, can we speak privately? I looked at Ethan. His face was flushed now, not with shame but with anger. He still thought this was just about manners, image, or an awkward moment that could be smoothed over with an apology and a drink. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet was already cracking. Yes, I said privately. Charles led the way through a side door near the stage. Daniel walked beside me. Ethan followed without an invitation, with Vanessa close behind. Compared to the ballroom, the hallway was silent. Our footsteps echoed on the polished marble. At the end of the corridor, Charles pushed open the door to a private executive lounge with dark wood walls, leather seating, and a long conference table. The moment the door closed, Ethan spoke up. What on earth is going on? Charles didn't answer him. He pulled out a chair for me. I sat down slowly. This seemed to anger Ethan more than anything else, the courtesy, the respect, and the way another powerful person in his company treated me better than he, my own son, did. Daniel placed his leather folder on the table, but didn't open it yet. Vanessa crossed her arms. This is becoming too dramatic. I looked at her. No, Vanessa, what happened in that ballroom was dramatic. This is just a delayed reckoning. She shut her mouth. Ethan stared at me. Delayed? Mom, what are you even talking about? I folded my hands in my lap. The pearls in my ears suddenly felt very heavy. Charles sat opposite me. Daniel remained standing. Ethan, Charles began, there are things about the history of this company you have never fully understood. Ethan let out a short, incredulous laugh. I run this company. You operate it, Daniel corrected. The room went dead silent. Ethan turned to him slowly. What did you say? Daniel opened the folder. My heart gave a sharp throb of pain. I had spent years running from this moment. For years I had told myself Ethan would mature, would soften, would remember. For years I had hoped I could keep the truth hidden until he was strong enough to receive it. But sometimes protection becomes enabling, and I had enabled too much. Daniel slid a document across the table, but Ethan didn't touch it. Alexander Global Solutions wasn't originally called that, Daniel said. It was Alexander Strategic Systems, a small regional consulting firm started with funds secured by your father, Robert Alexander. Ethan's eyes flickered. I know my dad was involved early on. What you know is a watered-down version, Charles said. Daniel continued. Robert wasn't just involved. During the company's most vulnerable years, he was the primary financial anchor. When banks refused loans, when early partners walked away, and when payroll was nearly missed twice, it was Robert who kept it alive. I remembered those years. Robert sitting at the kitchen table past midnight, papers spread before him, a hand pressed to his forehead. I would bring him coffee. The two of us spoke in whispers because Ethan was sleeping in the room down the hall. We can still pull out, I had told him once. Robert shook his head. If this works, Leela, it will protect you and Ethan, even when I'm gone. I hadn't wanted protection. I only wanted my husband alive. Daniel's voice brought me back to the present. Before Robert passed away, he transferred his controlling interest into a family trust. Ethan shot a glance at me. What trust? The Alexander Family Trust, Daniel said, with your mother serving as both trustee and the controlling beneficiary. Vanessa's arms dropped to her sides. Ethan stared at Daniel as if the man were speaking a foreign language. That's impossible, he said. Daniel didn't blink. It's the truth. Charles leaned forward. Your mother has held control of the trust for years, Ethan. The board has always known. Ethan looked at Charles. This makes no sense. I am the CEO. Yes, Charles said, you are the CEO, but that is not the same thing as the owner. The word hit the ground heavily. Owner. Ethan's expression changed. While he hadn't completely broken down, his supreme confidence began to fracture. He slowly turned to me. You own shares in the company. I looked at my son, the boy I raised, the man who had mocked my clothes in front of strangers. No, I said quietly, I control what truly matters at the core. Vanessa gripped the back of a chair. Why was no one ever told about this? Daniel's gaze shifted to her, because Robert's instructions were precise. Ethan had to build his career without relying on ownership. He had to learn to lead before inheriting power. Ethan's voice rose. So you all lied to me? No, I said, we gave you an opportunity. Anger flashed in his eyes. An opportunity? You let me work myself to the bone for years, thinking I built all of this on my own. You did work hard, I said. No one is taking away your effort, but you didn't build it alone. That statement seemed to offend him more than anything. That was how far he had drifted. An acknowledgement of gratitude now sounded to him like an insult. Charles placed his hands on the table. Ethan, recent issues have made this conversation unavoidable. What issues? Daniel pulled out a few more documents. Excessive discretionary spending billed to executive imaging campaigns, pressuring senior staff to resign just before retirement benefits vest, internal complaints regarding ageist remarks, supplier contracts awarded without proper review, and finally, the incident witnessed by half of the leadership team tonight. Vanessa quickly spoke up. Every CEO makes unpopular decisions. Unpopular and reckless are two different things, Charles fired back. Ethan looked at me, his eyes full of betrayed anger, as if I were the cause of the consequences of his actions. Did you bring him here? He asked, looking at Daniel. No, I said. Daniel came because he saw what I refused to see for too long. And what is that? My throat tightened, that my son has begun to mistake power for his own worth. For the first time, Ethan was speechless. I looked down at my hands, the ones he had mocked if not directly. The hands that had mended his jeans, held his report cards, signed loan applications, and packed his lunches in paper bags when a new backpack was out of reach. Your father was dying when he set up that trust, I said. He knew he couldn't stay to guide you. He asked me to protect the company, but more importantly, he asked me to protect you from becoming callous and unkind. Ethan turned his face away. Vanessa whispered, "This is ridiculous." Daniel closed the folder halfway. "What is truly ridiculous is that Mrs. Alexander was humiliated tonight in a building that exists because of sacrifices you never bothered to understand." The room fell into absolute silence again. I could hear faint applause coming through the walls from the ballroom. The celebration was continuing without us, a celebration of a legacy built on a perfectly packaged fiction. Ethan's features hardened. "If this is true, why keep it from me for all these years?" I met his gaze. "Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not because of what you needed from me." That silenced him for a split second. I saw pain cross his face, genuine pain, but quickly pride covered it up. Charles stood up. "We need to hold a board meeting tomorrow morning." Ethan snapped his head to look at him. "For what?" "To review leadership conduct and governance issues." "You can't be serious." "I am completely serious." Ethan looked at me. "Mom." The tone carried a plea, but it wasn't the one I had waited all these years to hear. He wasn't asking if I was hurt. He was begging me to save him from embarrassment. The difference broke my heart all over again. I stood up slowly. "I came tonight hoping to be your mother," I said. "Not your enemy, not your judge, just your mother." My voice trembled, but I didn't let it break. "But you were ashamed of me in front of people who never paid a single bill for you, never sat by your sickbed, and never went hungry so you could eat." Ethan swallowed. I walked toward the door. "Tonight I learned a painful lesson. You didn't really need to know what I own, Ethan. You needed to remember who raised you." No one followed immediately. As I opened the door, the sound of the gala rushed back in, the music, the laughter, the applause, a celebration built on a truth my son knew nothing about yet mocked so openly. As I walked back toward the ballroom, I knew that the secrets Robert left behind were finally starting to emerge from the dark. By the time I returned to the ballroom floor, I was no longer the woman who had walked in. Minutes ago, I had walked beneath those chandeliers hoping my son would remember me with kindness. Now I walked along the side aisle, Daniel's words still echoing in my chest. "You might need to stop letting him bring shame to you." The music was louder as I stepped back into the room. A large screen on the stage was playing a brief video showing the company's milestones. New offices opening, smiling executives, newspaper headlines, and images of Ethan shaking hands with high-profile people who looked like they owned the world. The guests applauded politely. I stood near the back, half hidden by a pillar, watching my son's face appear on the screen. "Ethan Alexander, bringing visionary leadership to a new generation." The text flashed beneath the image. Vision, leadership, a new generation. When beautiful words come from the wrong heart, they become excellent tools to cover an ugly truth. Daniel stood by my side without a word. Charles had stayed behind in the executive lounge, perhaps to steady himself before facing the board members scattered through the crowd. I knew him well enough. Charles was a man who weighed consequences before moving. But Ethan was not. Ethan operated entirely on pride. He always acted first and thought later, and only apologized when backed into a corner. He saw me before I saw him. He walked out of the side door into the ballroom with Vanessa. He was trying to maintain an appearance of calm, but his eyes were sharp and searching. The moment he spotted me near the pillar, his expression hardened. He moved quickly across the room, not running. Ethan would never run in front of investors, but every step carried fury. "Mom," he said, reaching me and speaking through clenched teeth, "we need to talk." Daniel shifted slightly. "Ethan, this isn't the place." My son ignored him. "I wasn't talking to you." I touched Daniel's sleeve. "It's all right." But it wasn't all right. Nothing about tonight was right. Ethan stepped closer, keeping his voice down. "What are you doing?" I looked at him, standing quietly. "No, you're creating a scene." I could barely stop myself from letting out a sorrowful chuckle. "I'm creating a scene." "You know what I mean." "I'm afraid I don't." His eyes scanned the room. A few people were starting to look at us again. Monica Reed stood near the stage, pretending to check a program but clearly keeping an eye on us. Ethan's assistant, Tyler Jensen, hovered near the media table with a tablet, his face tense. Ethan noticed the eyes too. It made him more irritated. "Come with me," he said. He reached for my arm, not roughly enough to cause a scene but certainly not gently. Daniel's voice turned stern. Ethan. My son stopped, his fingers barely brushing my sleeve. She is my mother. Yes, Daniel said, then act like a son. For a second I thought Ethan would strike back with vicious words. Instead he turned to me. Please, he said, though there was no humility in the word, just step into the hallway. I should have refused, but somewhere deep inside, I still wanted to give him one last chance away from the eyes of strangers. One last chance to drop his voice, to say he was sorry, to admit he was just shocked, embarrassed, and reacting poorly. So I followed him into the corridor. Vanessa followed, of course. The ballroom doors had barely closed behind us before Ethan turned on me. Do you have any idea what you just did? I stared at him. What did I do? You let Charles and that lawyer ambush me at my own event. Daniel is not that lawyer. He has been protecting this family longer than Vanessa has known our last name. Vanessa's lips tightened. That's unnecessary. Mocking my dress was unnecessary too, I countered. She looked away. Ethan paced a step and stopped. This is exactly what I was worried about. You come here, get emotional, and suddenly everything is about old wounds. Old wounds, I repeated softly. Yes, old wounds. The past, the struggle, my dad, the sacrifices, all of it. He rubbed his forehead. Tonight was supposed to be about the company. This is about the company. No, now it's about you, he said, bitterness leaking into his words. There lay the truth beneath his anger. He wasn't sorry for hurting me. He was angry that my pain was inconveniencing him. I looked at the man in front of me, searching for the boy I used to love, the one I had stayed up with through fevers, nightmares, report cards, heartbreaks, and difficult bills. I could still see traces of him in the shape of his mouth, the way his left eyebrow lifted when defensive, and the anxious movement of his hands. But his heart felt so far away from me. Ethan, I said, do you understand what happened in there? I understand that you and Daniel have been keeping secrets behind my back. I kept silent because I loved you. He scoffed. That's a convenient excuse. It's the truth. No, the truth is you made me look like a fool. The hallway felt like it was closing in on us. I heard Vanessa take a sharp breath, but she didn't correct him. I let the word settle in the air. A fool. That was what mattered to him. He didn't care that he had mocked his mother. He didn't care that he had stabbed the woman who raised him. He didn't care that his father's legacy was being reduced to a stage prop and a PR stunt. He cared that he looked like a fool. I nodded slowly. I see. Ethan took a step closer. Do you really see? Because I don't think you do. I spent years building credibility in rooms like this, years proving I belong here. And now in one night people are whispering because my mother showed up wearing. He stopped. But I heard the rest. Vanessa heard it too. Wearing what? I asked. Ethan's jaw twitched. I didn't mean it like that. Then say what you mean. He turned his face away. Vanessa stepped in, her voice low and smooth. Leela, things are getting out of hand. Ethan is under immense pressure. You have to understand that at this level, image is critical. At this level, I said. Yes, she answered. This isn't a small-town fundraiser. This is a corporate environment. I turned fully to her. And is it acceptable in a corporate environment for a man to publicly humiliate his mother? Her face flushed. That's not fair of you to say. No, I said, it is. It was the first time Vanessa found herself without a polished response. Ethan pointed toward the ballroom. You need to leave. The words were quiet, but they cut deeper than his laughter earlier. I looked at him closely. You are asking your mother to leave. His eyes were cold now, but beneath the coldness was panic. Panic that the night was slipping out of his control. Panic that others knew something he didn't. Panic that the woman he treated as an ornament was tied to the very foundation beneath his feet. You're making things worse, he said. So yes, I think it's best if you go back to the hotel. I came here because you invited me. I invited you because the board expected family representation. There was the final piece. Not out of love, not out of pride, not out of missing me, but out of expectation. I felt an incredible stillness settle somewhere inside me. For years I had made excuses for him. He was busy, he was stressed, Vanessa influenced him, New York changed people, success came with pressure, he would come around, he would remember. but sometimes a mother's excuses become the cage she builds for her own suffering, and right now, I was suddenly tired of living in that cage. I understand, I said. Ethan blinked, as if expecting tears, a plea or an apology, but my voice didn't crack. I hope one day, I continued, you remember who stood beside you before anyone else did. His expression shifted slightly. The words touched something, not enough to change him completely, but it touched something. Vanessa looked uncomfortable. Leela, let's not make this overly sentimental. I turned to her. When people no longer respect love, they call it sentimental. She fell silent. At the end of the hallway, Tyler Jensen stood frozen by a service door, clutching a stack of programs. He had heard enough. His young face was pale, and when Ethan noticed him, the fury erupted again. Tyler, Ethan snapped, what are you doing? The young man swallowed. I was just bringing the updated speaker list, sir. Take it somewhere else. Yes, sir, but before leaving, Tyler's eyes moved to me. It wasn't pity this time. It looked more like shame, not his own shame, but my son's. Ethan turned back to me. I'll have security arrange a car. A car, I repeated, to send me away. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the night had become so painfully clear. He stood in a building built on my husband's sacrifices, in a company protected by my signature, wrapped in power given to him by a trust he never earned, and he was offering to have security show me out. Before I could answer, the ballroom doors opened. Charles Whitmore stepped into the hallway, with Daniel Brooks right behind him. Neither man looked surprised. Charles's gaze moved from Ethan to me. Is everything all right? Ethan straightened up immediately. Yes, I'm just handling a family matter. Charles's voice was quiet. When it impacts the company, it stops being just a family matter. Ethan's expression darkened. With all due respect, Charles, you don't have a say in what happens between me and my mother. Daniel stepped forward. When you attempt to remove the controlling trustee from a corporate event, intervention becomes a matter of governance. Vanessa's eyes widened. Ethan froze. The words echoed in the corridor like a striking bell. Controlling trustee. There was no softening that title, no hiding it behind a family misunderstanding, and no laughing it off as an old woman's drama. Charles looked at me. Mrs. Alexander, would you like to leave? The choice was mine. That alone seemed to unnerve Ethan. I looked toward the ballroom doors, where the music and applause were still going on as if nothing had happened. Then I looked at my son, the very pride that had brought us into this narrow hallway under the bright hotel lights. I will leave tonight, I said, not because Ethan asked me to, but because I refuse to be displayed when it's convenient and discarded when it's embarrassing. Ethan's face was tight. But tomorrow, I continued, I will be attending the board meeting. Vanessa gasped, the board meeting. Charles nodded, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Ethan whipped his head toward him. You've got to be kidding me. I am entirely serious, Charles said. Daniel's voice was softer but carried more weight. We will review the documentation, address the conduct issues, and discuss the future of leadership. For the first time all evening, a look of fear crossed Ethan's face. Not a sorry look, not yet, but fear. I picked up my purse, smoothed the front of my navy blue dress, and walked past him. As I reached the elevators, I heard Ethan call out behind me. Mom. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. There was a pause, enough time for an apology, enough time for a son to be a son again. But all he said was, don't do this. I closed my eyes and stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, I saw Charles and Daniel standing behind him like judges, with Vanessa pale at his side, and my son standing alone in the middle of the corridor, surrounded by everything he thought gave him power. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to save him from the consequences of his own cruelty. I barely slept that night. The hotel room Ethan had arranged for me was beautiful, far nicer than anything I would have chosen for myself. The bed was wide and soft, the curtains were heavy, and the bathroom was lined with marble. Through the window, New York glittered below me, looking like a city sprinkled with diamonds. But a beautiful view can't cure a broken heart. I sat in the chair by the window until nearly dawn, still wearing the navy blue dress Ethan had mocked. My shoes sat beside me, my feet ached and my back was sore. But those pains were simple, they belonged to the body. The ache in my chest was harder to define. At some point I pulled the wrapped compass from my purse. Vanessa must have put it back with Ethan's things during the chaos, because Tyler Jensen had quietly handed it to me before I left the gala. He had found me near the elevators, speaking in almost a whisper. "Mrs. Alexander, I think this belongs to you." His eyes were full of apology, even though he had done nothing wrong. I thanked him and kept the package with me all the way to my room. Now I unwrapped it slowly. The silver compass lay in my palm, cold and small. I opened the lid. The needle trembled, searching, and then pointed steadily north. When the noise of success is deafening, I read the card I had written, "Remember where home is." My throat tightened. I had bought it for Ethan, but maybe I was the one who needed direction now. At 8:30 the next morning, Daniel Brooks knocked on my door. He wore the same calm expression he had carried for 30 years, but his eyes softened when he saw me. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." "No." I stepped aside to let him in. He carried a leather briefcase this time, not just a folder. That meant business. "The board is assembling," he said. I nodded. "Charles requested that we arrive together." I looked at the bed where the navy dress was folded neatly. I had changed into a simple grey blouse and a black skirt, both old but clean. My pearl earrings were still in place. "Do I need to bring anything?" I asked. Daniel's eyes drifted to the compass on the table, then back to me. "Just your resolve." I managed a tired smile. "I don't know how much resolve I have left." "You have more than you think." We rode the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, people hurried past with coffee cups and rolling bags. No one knew that my life had flipped upside down in a single night. No one knew that a mother was about to sit across from her son and let the truth finish what love couldn't do. Outside, a black car was waiting. Charles was already inside. He leaned forward as I climbed in. "Mrs. Alexander, I am deeply sorry for what happened last night." I looked at him. "You didn't cause it." "No," he said, "but perhaps I should have intervened sooner. The board has had concerns about Uthan for months." I turned to him. "For months?" Charles and Daniel exchanged a look. "Yes," he said. "His leadership style has become increasingly driven by appearance over substance. Good people have left, others have been pushed out. Monica Reed has documented troubling patterns." I looked down at my hands. Uthan hadn't just become ashamed of me, he had started treating others the same way. That strung in a different, deeper way, because a mother can forgive harm done to herself far more easily than she can accept that her child has learned how to hurt the world. The corporate headquarters rose over the Manhattan streets like a glass blade. Alexander Global Solutions, the silver letters spanned across the main entrance. Yesterday, I had stood beneath that name as a humiliated mother. Today, I walked in as the person whose signature had quietly protected it years ago. The security guard greeted Charles first, then Daniel, and finally me. "Good morning, Mrs. Alexander," the guard said. There was no mockery in his voice. We took the elevator to the executive floor. The doors opened to a quiet reception area with polished floors and framed accolades on the walls. I recognized Uthan in several photos, smiling next to governors, shaking hands with CEOs, attending ribbon cuttings. I wondered how many of those smiles were real. The boardroom doors were closed. Muffled voices came from behind them. Charles paused before pushing them open. "Are you ready?" "No," but I nodded anyway. The room inside was long and bright, with a glass wall overlooking the city. The board members sat around a dark table. Monica Reed was there, a stack of reports in front of her. Daniel placed his briefcase near the end. Tyler Jensen stood near the screen with his tablet, looking pale and tense. And Uthan sat at the head of the table. Of course he did. He wore a navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie I recognized as a birthday gift I had sent him years ago. He had never told me he wore it. Seeing it at his throat almost broke me. Vanessa sat beside him, dressed in ivory, her posture rigid and defensive. When Uthan saw me, he stood up. For a fraction of a second, I thought he might walk toward me. Instead, he said, "I don't see why this is necessary." Charles closed the door behind us. "Sit down, Uthan." My son's face tightened. "I am sitting in the head chair of my own boardroom." "This is the company's boardroom," Charles said without raising his voice. "And today the board will determine if you are fit to continue leading it." The silence that followed was razor-sharp. Uthan slowly took his seat. I pulled out a chair near Daniel and sat down, not at the head, not next to Uthan. I didn't need a throne to prove what I held in my hands. Charles spoke. Multiple members of this board witnessed the behavior of the CEO at the 20th anniversary gala last night. Those actions have raised serious concerns about judgment, professionalism, and company culture. Uthan leaned back in his chair. This is ridiculous. It was a family moment taken out of context. Monica Reed spoke for the first time. With all due respect, Uthan, it happened in front of staff, guests, and investors. It was a joke, he said. Monica didn't look away. Some members of the staff didn't find it funny. Vanessa chimed in. The staff is sensitive about everything these days. Monica turned to her. Dignity isn't sensitivity. I wanted to look at her with gratitude, but I kept my eyes on the table. Charles nodded to Daniel. Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out several documents. He placed them in front of every board member with practiced, precise movements. The purpose of this meeting, Daniel said, is twofold. First, to review governance authority under the Alexander Family Trust, and second, to address documented concerns regarding executive conduct. Uthan let out a humorless laugh. So we're really doing this? Yes, Daniel said, we are. He turned on the screen. A legal summary appeared. It's Alexander Family Trust, controlling beneficiary and trustee, Leela Alexander, executive appointment authority, subject to board review and trustee oversight. Uthan stared at the screen. The culk had drained completely from Vanessa's face. Charles laced his fingers together. Uthan, you serve as CEO by appointment of the board. Your role has never been above the authority of the trust. Nobody ever told me this, Uthan said. Daniel looked at him. You were told enough to lead responsibly, Uthan. You weren't told everything to prevent you from abusing what you didn't own. Uthan slammed a hand on the table. I grew this company to what it is today. Yes, Charles said, and recently you have jeopardized it. Monica opened her report. She didn't speak with malice. That made it worse. She listed complaints from senior staff who had been mocked as outdated, described pressure placed on older employees to force early retirement, pointed out instances where department budgets were cut while executive expenses were directed toward luxury imaging, and noted Vanessa's involvement in vendor introductions without any formal role. Vanessa stiffened. I was helping. Monica looked at her. You were influencing procurement without authorization. Uthan turned to Monica. You've been gathering this behind my back. I've been doing my job, she said. Tuller stood by the screen, his eyes downcast. Charles noticed him. Tuller, he said, you submitted a statement regarding last night. Uthan whipped his head around. Tuller. The young man swallowed. Yes, sir. Read the relevant portion, Charles said. Tuller looked at his tablet, his hands shaking slightly. At approximately 40 p.m., I witnessed Mr. Alexander request that Mrs. Alexander leave the event following a public humiliation. He stated she was invited because the board expected family representation. Mrs. Alexander inquired if he was asking his mother to leave. He confirmed that he was. Uthan's face went dark. You recorded that? No, sir, Tuller said softly. I remembered it. The quiet in the room was terrible. Remembered it. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a recording. Sometimes cruelty is clear enough to burn itself into the memory of whoever sees it. Uthan looked at me. It was the first time all morning he really looked at me. His eyes moved over my grey shirt, my tired face, my hands folded in my lap. Maybe he saw the woman from last night. Maybe he saw the mother from years ago. Maybe, for one awful moment, he saw that no one in this room was going to pretend his behavior was acceptable anymore. Mom, he said, his voice much smaller now. I didn't answer, because this wasn't the hallway, this wasn't my kitchen, this wasn't a place where a hurt call from him could soften me out of a consequence. Charles leaned forward. Uthan, do you understand what your mother represents to this company? Uthan's lips were pressed tight. He looked at the papers, at Daniel, at me. I understand what you're all claiming, he said. Daniel's expression turned severe. These aren't claims. He pushed the original trust certification across the table. This was signed by your father 12 days before his final hospitalization. Your mother has honored every term for 20 years. She let you grow, let you lead, and let you make mistakes, but she never gave up control. Uthan's hand hovered over the paper, but he didn't touch it. Vanessa whispered, "Uthan, say something." He looked at her. For the first time ever, I saw uncertainty between them. Vanessa had loved the version of Uthan that seemed unbreakable. This room was showing her another version, a smaller, frightened one. Charles stood up. "Effective immediately, this board will consider a motion to temporarily suspend Leela Alexander's executive authority, pending a full review." Uthan shot out of his chair. "You can't suspend me." Charles looked at me. Everyone looked at me. The room seemed to tilt. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times and prayed it would never come. I had prayed Uthan would choose humility before shame forced it on him. I had prayed love would teach him what power couldn't. But prayers aren't always answered by avoiding disaster. Sometimes they are answered by requiring the courage to face it. I stood up slowly. "My son is not my enemy," I said. Ethan's expression flickered, but he has forgotten what leadership means. If this company carries my family's name, it will not be led by shame, cruelty, or vanity. No one spoke. I turned to Ethan. "You mocked my clothes because you thought they made me look small. But the woman who bought those clothes survived everything you are mocking now. If you cannot respect that woman, you are not ready to lead the company she helped protect." Ethan's gaze dropped for half a second. Just half a second, but I saw it. Charles nodded. "The motion will proceed," he said. As Daniel began to read the formal resolution, I looked out the window at the city, feeling the walls of a long silence finally begin to tumble down. Daniel's voice echoed in the boardroom, carrying a calmness that made the truth feel even heavier. He didn't rush, and he didn't dramatize. He simply read what was on the page, as if every word had been waiting 20 years to be spoken aloud. The Alexander Family Trust, established by Robert James Alexander, designates Leela Marie Alexander as controlling trustee and primary beneficiary. The trust holds the controlling interest in Alexander Global Solutions and all its preceding entities. Ethan stared at the documents in front of him. He was pale, but his pride was still fighting. "This is crazy," he said. "My dad would never hide something like this from me." Daniel looked over his glasses at him. "Your father didn't hide it to punish you, Ethan. He hid it to protect you." "Protect me from what?" The room went quiet. Daniel didn't answer. He looked at me. Suddenly I was back in that hospital room 20 years ago. I was holding Robert's hand, surrounded by the sound of machines breathing and ticking. His skin was warm, but the life was slipping away. His voice was faint, but his mind was sharp. "Leela," he had whispered, "promise me you won't let Ethan take control until he learns humility." I had cried then. I told him Ethan was a good boy. Robert squeezed my fingers. "He is, but if no one teaches him gratitude, success will starve his soul." Standing in this boardroom now, I felt the full weight of that promise. I looked at Ethan. "Your father loved you," I said, "deeper than you know." A flash of anger came into Ethan's eyes. "Don't use my dad to justify this." "I'm not using him, I'm honoring him." Vanessa leaned forward. If Leela had this much control, why did she let Ethan work so hard? Why let him think he was building something? Charles answered before I could. Because letting him lead without a sense of entitlement was the entire point. Daniel nodded. Robert wanted Ethan to earn his place through performance, not inheritance. Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "So my entire life has been a test." "No," I said, "it was an opportunity to become a man worthy of what your father left behind." He opened his mouth but didn't say anything. For the first time, I saw confusion beneath his anger. He had spent years believing he was the center of the story. Now he was discovering he was just a chapter in a much older, deeper, and more carefully guarded one. Daniel pushed another document forward. "This is the original capitalization agreement," he said. "It was Robert and Leela Alexander who provided the emergency funds that kept the company alive during its first major crisis." Ethan's eyes turned to me. I could almost hear his thoughts. "Leela, not just Dad, me." Daniel continued, explaining that after Robert became gravely ill, it was Mrs. Alexander who signed the agreements for the second round of funding. She was the one who personally authorized the continuation plan that kept the company from going under. I remembered that day so clearly. Robert was far too weak to leave the house. Daniel sat at our kitchen table, the very table Ethan would later look down on, with papers spread out everywhere. Daniel pointed and I signed. My hands were shaking so badly that the first signature barely looked like my own. I didn't understand all the complex business jargon, but I understood Robert's dream, and I knew I had to protect my son's future. Ethan's voice dropped, losing its edge. He asked if I had really signed those corporate documents. I told him yes. He stared at me, stammering that I had never talked about the business. I looked him in the eye and told him that I talked about the things that mattered most, but before I could talk about anything else, he had already stopped listening. Those words hit him hard. His gaze dropped instantly to the table. Vanessa's face went rigid. She looked from Ethan to the board members, her mind visibly racing as she tried to calculate her next move, desperately searching for solid ground now that the foundation beneath them had completely shattered. She tried to salvage the situation, arguing that none of this changed the fact that Ethan had always been the public face of the company. Monica Reed spoke up, her voice quiet but unyielding. She said no one was denying his contributions, but they were absolutely questioning his judgment. Vanessa turned on her, snapping that Monica had clearly been waiting for this exact day. Monica's expression remained perfectly calm. She replied that she had been waiting for the day of accountability. That word seemed to hang heavily in the air, accountability. It sounded so simple, but in that room it felt like a massive door Ethan had been running from for years. Charles folded his hands on the table. He looked at Ethan and said the issue wasn't just about ownership, but whether Ethan truly understood the responsibility that comes with leadership. Ethan snapped his head up, defending himself by saying he had led the company to record-breaking growth. Monica shot back instantly, noting that he had also caused a record-breaking turnover rate among senior staff. Ethan argued that he had to make hard choices, but Monica corrected him, saying he had made dismissive choices and that there was a profound difference between the two. Daniel turned to the final page of the trust summary. He read the terms explicitly, stating that when an executive's actions threaten the ethical foundation or the long-term stability of the company, Mrs. Alexander retains the authority to approve, restrict, or recommend the removal of executive leadership. Ethan pushed his chair back violently. He asked if that was it, if his mother was the one who got to decide whether he kept his job. The way he said "my mother" carried a sharp sting. There was no affection in it, only disbelief, as if motherhood somehow disqualified me from having sound judgment, or as if the woman who raised him couldn't possibly understand the weight of consequences. I stood up slowly. I told him no, it wasn't me deciding. His own actions had made the decision for him. He looked at me, his breathing heavy and erratic, accusing me of letting him walk into the room completely blind. I answered him calmly, saying he had walked into the room with arrogance, and just like before, there was a major difference. A few board members shifted in their seats, but nobody interrupted. The strength in my own voice surprised me. It wasn't loud and it didn't shake. It simply carried the immense weight of all the years I had chosen to stay silent. I looked at my son and told him the truth. He had mocked my clothes because he thought they proved I didn't belong in his world. He had allowed his wife to look down on my past because he wanted to erase where he came from. And he hadn't invited me to that gala because he wanted his mother there. He did it because the board wanted to see a wholesome family image. Ethan's jaw clenched tightly. I told him I heard everything, every single word. Vanessa quickly looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I kept going, telling him that he wanted me to be quiet, refined, useful, and invisible. But he had forgotten the one thing his father never forgot. I placed my hand firmly on the trust documents. Legacies aren't built by the people who demand the spotlight in public. They are built by the people who make silent sacrifices when no one is watching. For the very first time, Ethan looked genuinely hurt, but his pride still took over. He muttered that I should have told him sooner. I agreed that maybe I should have, but then I reminded him that perhaps he should have respected his mother, even when he believed she had nothing left to offer him. He fell completely silent. The entire boardroom seemed to hold its breath. Charles turned his attention to Ethan, announcing that the board would now vote on immediately suspending his executive authority, pending a full internal review. Vanessa bolted upright, calling the whole thing outrageous. Charles turned to her coldly, reminding her that she was not a member of the board. Her face flushed bright red in an instant. Ethan didn't even attempt to defend her, he just kept staring at me. Daniel read the motion aloud, and the board members cast their votes one by one. Each approval felt like a heavy stone dropping into deep water. When Charles cast the final vote, he turned toward me. He called my name, asking for my vote. I felt every eye in the room lock onto my face. This was the exact moment Ethan had dreaded. And deep down, maybe I feared it too, because no mother ever wants to be the one to hand down a harsh lesson to her own child. But love without truth is just weakness, and I had mistaken that weakness for kindness for far too long. I looked at Ethan. I cast my vote in favor of the suspension. The change in his expression was subtle, not dramatic like in the movies. His lips parted slightly, and his shoulders slumped just a fraction. He searched my face, looking at his own mother as if he were staring at a total stranger. But I wasn't a stranger. I was the exact same person I had always been. He had just never bothered to really look at me. Charles nodded, declaring the motion carried. Vanessa whispered Ethan's name, but he didn't move an inch. Daniel closed his folder, stating that effective immediately, Ethan Alexander's authority as CEO was officially suspended, pending the internal review. In the meantime, temporary oversight of the company's operations would be handled by the executive committee under the board's direction. The words were entirely formal, but the damage was deeply personal. Ethan stood up incredibly slowly. He looked at me and bitterly said, "Congratulations, Mom." The raw resentment in his voice cut through me, but I refused to let it show. I told him this wasn't about revenge. He let out a short, hollow laugh and asked what else I could possibly call it. I took a step closer to him. I told him I called it the most honest moment we had shared in years. His eyes flickered. For a split second I thought he might actually cry, but then Vanessa grabbed her designer bag and stood rigidly by his side, telling him they needed to leave. Ethan stood frozen for a moment. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small silver compass, the one he had never bothered to open. I placed it gently on the table right in front of him. I told him that when I bought it for him, I had no idea the night would end like this. I had simply thought that one day he might really need it. He stared down at it, asking what it was. I told him it was a reminder that a person can lose their way long before they ever lose their title. No one spoke. Before the tears could spill over, I turned around. As Daniel opened the boardroom door for me, I knew Ethan was still standing behind me at the head of that long table, a table that no longer belonged to him. For the first time in his life, my son wasn't looking at me with embarrassment. He looked at me with the sudden, heavy realization that he had completely underestimated someone, and the saddest part of all was that I had never wanted to prove him wrong. I had only wanted to remind him of what it meant to do what was right. By noon the next day, the news had spread through the entire company. It didn't happen through an official announcement at first. Corporations rarely lay the absolute truth out in the open so quickly. Instead, it leaked through closed doors, lowered voices, unanswered emails, and the hurried footsteps of assistants rushing down the hallways. Ethan Alexander had been suspended. The sentence hung over the entire building like a dark cloud. After the vote, I didn't stay in the boardroom. Daniel walked me to a smaller conference room where Charles assured me I could have some privacy. The room looked out over the vast city skyline, but I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I sat at the table with my hands tightly folded, listening to the distant, muffled hum of a company trying desperately to pretend it was business as usual. But everything had changed. Daniel placed a warm cup of tea in front of me, telling me I had done what was necessary. I stared at the steam rising from the cup, admitting that the necessity didn't make it hurt any less. He agreed quietly that it never did. A few minutes later, Charles and Monica Reed walked in. Monica held a thick folder tightly against her chest, but the sharp look she wore in the boardroom had softened completely. She apologized to me directly for the way things had played out the night before. I looked up and told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. She sighed, saying that perhaps she didn't personally, but she had watched the culture of the company shift over the years. She had documented it and raised concerns, but she knew that many employees had felt completely invisible for far too long. Invisible, that word struck a chord with me. I told her I understood that feeling perfectly. Monica nodded, her eyes full of genuine understanding. Charles sat across from me, explaining that they needed to discuss the next steps. Investors needed reassurance, and the employees needed a formal statement. They planned to frame Ethan's suspension as a temporary measure while the internal review took place. I asked him straight out if Ethan would ever be allowed to return. Charles hesitated before answering, saying that ultimately that would be up to Ethan. I nodded. It was the answer I expected, and the one I dreaded because deep down, a part of me still wanted someone to step in and tell me it was permanently over, that I would never have to bear the brunt of his cruelty again. But when a child chooses a destructive path, the realities of being a parent don't just vanish. They only become far more painful to navigate. On the other side of the building, Ethan was still in his office. I knew this because Taylor had quietly informed Daniel that Ethan had gone straight there after the meeting, with Vanessa following him like a shadow. I pictured him standing behind his massive desk, staring out at the skyline, furious that the world wasn't bowing to his will. I imagined Vanessa packing the floor, frantic and angry. I didn't have to imagine it for long. The door to the conference room burst open without a knock. Vanessa walked in first, her face completely pale with rage. Ethan stood right behind her, silent. His suit jacket was unbuttoned and his tie was loosened. In that moment, he looked far less like a powerful CEO and much more like a man stripped of a costume he wasn't ready to take off. Charles stood up immediately, stating that this was a private meeting. Vanessa completely ignored him, locking her eyes onto me. She demanded to know how I could do something like this to my own son. Her voice shook violently, fueled entirely by anger rather than grief. I stayed seated, telling her quietly that now was not the time. She snapped back that it was exactly the time, pointing toward the hallway. She told me people were whispering, investors were calling, and Ethan's entire reputation was being ruined. I looked past her to Ethan, but he remained completely silent. So I turned back to her and said his reputation wasn't being ruined by accountability, it was ruined by his own behavior. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh, accusing me of talking high and mighty now that I held all the power. Daniel's voice cut in sharply, pointing out that Mrs. Alexander had possessed that power for years. She had simply chosen to exercise restraint. Vanessa turned on him, yelling that he was just helping me humiliate him. But Daniel held his ground, stating he was helping protect the company from further damage. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low as he told Vanessa to drop it. She turned to him in utter shock, asking how he could say that when they had just stripped him of everything he built. He looked at me, that deep bitterness returning to his eyes, as he softly repeated the phrase, "my company." I stood up to face him, telling him that was the exact problem. He still believed that ownership was the only thing that made something truly belong to him. His eyes hardened as he told me not to lecture him. I told him I wasn't lecturing him, I was simply telling him the truth he had been running from for years. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly, accusing me of waiting for the absolute worst moment to expose all of this. She argued I could have spoken to him privately or warned him, but instead chose to do it in front of the entire board. That accusation struck a nerve because it wasn't entirely false. I had waited too long, but I hadn't chosen to drag the truth into the light in such a harsh manner. I told her I hadn't chosen the timing. Ethan had chosen it himself by his actions the night before. Ethan quickly looked away. Vanessa raised her voice even louder, defending him by saying it was just a joke. Monica, who had been quiet until now, took a step forward. She informed Vanessa that she had already reviewed 3 formal complaints from employees who had witnessed that exact joke the previous evening. One of them had written that if the CEO could publicly degrade his own mother, no employee was safe from his contempt. Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Charles added that 2 major investors had already called, asking if the leadership instability reflected deeper governance issues. He told her plainly that this had evolved far beyond a piece of family drama. Ethan's face remained tense. He asked what happens next. Charles looked at him firmly, reiterating that his executive authority was entirely suspended. He would retain access to legal counsel and have the right to respond to the review, but he could no longer issue corporate directives, contact department heads regarding business decisions, or speak to the media on behalf of the company. Ethan forced a bleak smile, asking if he was being treated like a criminal now. I told him no. He was finally being treated like a grown man who had to take responsibility for what he had done. His gaze snapped back to me instantly. He demanded to know what I wanted from him, whether I wanted him to beg, cry, or offer a public apology. The room fell completely silent. I stared at him for a long time. What did I want? I wanted the impossible. I wanted my little boy back. I wanted the 12-year-old who used to sit at the kitchen table and ask if I had eaten yet. I wanted the Ethan who existed before money taught him to measure people by their net worth, before Vanessa's glamorous world made him feel ashamed of chipped plates and old coats, and before success became louder than love. But you can't ask for those things in a corporate boardroom, so I told him the only thing that still carried any real meaning. I told him I wanted him to learn respect, before everything inside him that was actually worth respecting disappeared entirely. His expression crumbled for a fraction of a second as a wave of sharp pain crossed his face, but just like before, his pride quickly buried it. Vanessa stepped closer to him, grabbing his sleeve and urging him to leave, claiming they were just trying to break him. I looked down at her hand on his arm, saying quietly that we weren't trying to break him, we were trying to stop him from breaking everyone else. Ethan gently but deliberately pulled his arm away from Vanessa's grasp. It was a tiny movement, but everyone in the room noticed it. Vanessa felt the rejection instantly, her eyes narrowing sharply as she questioned him. He looked completely exhausted, telling her he just needed some air. With that, he walked out of the room. Vanessa stood frozen for a second, a volatile mix of anger and uncertainty washing over her face, before she turned and followed him out. Once the door clicked shut, none of us spoke for a long time. Charles let out a slow, heavy breath, admitting the confrontation had gone better than he had anticipated. I felt a faint, sad smile tug at my lips, but my throat was far too tight to speak. Monica gathered her files, stating she was going to draft the internal memo for the staff. Daniel looked at me quietly, asking what I planned to do next. I walked over to the window. Far below, the people of Manhattan moved like tiny, insignificant parts of a machine that never stopped running. The city didn't care about my son's downfall. The world rarely pauses for private heartbreaks. I told him I was going home the next morning. Daniel nodded understandingly, clarifying that I was heading back to Ohio. I confirmed that I was. Charles looked somewhat surprised, suggesting that the company might need me to stay close by. But I told him the company had a board, lawyers, and people who knew exactly how to manage a crisis. I turned away from the window, saying that now that the applause had stopped, Ethan needed to figure out exactly what kind of man he wanted to be. Daniel kept his eyes on me as I picked up my purse. I added that if he chose to let anger consume him, he would simply learn the hard way that anger can never recover what arrogance threw away. As I made my way out, I walked past Ethan's office. The door was cracked open just an inch. Inside, I saw the silver compass sitting on his desk. It was still closed, but it was no longer pushed aside. It wasn't forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't change, not yet, but it was the very first sign of the dust beginning to settle. Sometimes, before a heart can truly open up, it has to lose the illusion that it is completely untouchable. The next morning, I traveled back to Ohio. Daniel had offered to stay with me in New York, and Charles thought it best if I remained nearby in case the board needed an immediate decision. Monica had even gone out of her way to set up a quiet, private office for me if I wanted to avoid the media entirely. But I had absolutely no desire to sit in that glass tower and watch my son's pride unravel piece by piece. So I went home. The flight back felt significantly longer than the trip out. I sat by the window, staring down at the clouds that looked so peaceful from above, even though I knew a storm could easily be hiding underneath. My hands rested quietly in my lap. The pearl earrings were still in my ears, but I had changed out of the navy blue dress, folding it carefully into my suitcase. It had survived the night, and so had I. When the taxi finally pulled into my driveway, the small white house looked exactly the same as the day I left. The porch railing still desperately needed a coat of paint. The maple tree was dropping yellow leaves onto the walkway, and the mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Absolutely nothing had altered. Yet I felt completely different, carrying a profound exhaustion, as if I had just returned from a war my neighbors knew nothing about. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. I set my suitcase down by the door, slipped off my shoes, and just stood there in the absolute silence. And then I broke down. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply the kind of quiet cracking that happens when a woman has had to be strong for far too long, finally letting go the moment she finds herself in a room where no one is watching. I cried for the boy Ethan used to be, and I cried for the man he had chosen to become. I cried for Robert, who had foreseen the dangers of unchecked success long before I ever did. After a while I wiped my face, brewed a hot cup of tea, and walked into my bedroom. The small metal box was right where I left it, tucked away in the closet beneath the blankets. I brought it out and set it on the bed. For years that box had felt like a heavy obligation, but that day it felt like a silent witness to everything we had endured. The key was tucked inside an old envelope in the top drawer of my nightstand. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the lock. Inside were the copies of the documents Daniel had prepared, but there were also things the board had never seen. There were letters from Robert, his final notes, photographs from our early years, and a paper napkin from the diner where I used to work, featuring Ethan's childhood handwriting on the back. Even when she burns the toast, Mom is the best cook. A tear fell, but I couldn't help but laugh softly at the memory. Then I found the letter Robert had written specifically for Ethan, the one he asked me to give to him only when the time was truly right. The envelope had yellowed over the years. Ethan's name was written across the front in Robert's distinct, steady handwriting, just his name, nothing else. I traced the letters with my finger. Robert had written this just 12 days before his final stay in the hospital, the exact same week he signed the trust papers. He understood far more than he ever let on. Men like Robert always try to shield the people they love from fear, even when that fear is sitting right next to them in the room. I didn't open the letter. The time wasn't right yet. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the memories carry me back. Ethan was only 8 years old when he first realized we had less than other families. It was a brutally cold December, and he had fallen in love with a bright red winter coat in a department store window. It had shiny silver snaps and a hood lined with soft faux fur. He stood pressed against the glass, staring at it as if it were the greatest treasure on earth. I told him gently that maybe we could get it next week. He nodded, trying to hide the deep disappointment clear across his little face. But next week never came. I ended up finding an old brown coat at a church bazaar instead, sewing a sturdy patch over a torn pocket. When I handed it to him, he forced a smile and said it was very warm. That night, I heard him crying quietly in his room. The next morning, I walked 2 miles through the freezing snow to take on an extra cleaning shift. By Christmas Eve, I had scraped together just enough money to buy that red coat. It wasn't brand new, it was missing a button, so the store had marked it down, but I bought it anyway, finding a matching button in my sewing kit to fix it up. When Ethan unwrapped it, he threw his arms tightly around my neck and whispered that one day, he was going to buy me the best coat in the entire world. I held him close, telling him he didn't need to buy me a thing. I just wanted him to grow up to be a kind person. That was the only thing I ever truly wanted for him. Not wealth, not high status, just kindness. Another memory drifted in. Ethan was 16, throwing a massive tantrum because I refused to let him quit his summer job stocking shelves at the local grocery store. He claimed the work was embarrassing and that the wealthy kids at school didn't have to do things like that. I told him plainly that honest work is never embarrassing, but looking down on it absolutely is. He refused to speak to me for 2 whole days. On the 3rd night, as I was washing the dishes, he walked into the kitchen quietly and apologized. I kissed his forehead. Back then, saying sorry came so much easier to him. Back then, his pride hadn't yet learned how to wear an expensive suit. Back in New York, Ethan spent that entire afternoon isolated in his penthouse. I didn't learn the exact details until much later, when a recovered Tuller spoke to Daniel months down the road, at a time when the truth didn't sting quite as badly. After leaving the office, Ethan had returned home in a dark, silent rage. Vanessa followed him from room to room, her words coming at him in a rapid blur, insisting they needed lawyers, a crisis public relations team, and a formal statement. She suggested they frame the situation as an elderly woman being manipulated, or blame it all on a political coup within the board. Ethan just stood by the window, staring down at Manhattan, and muttered that she was his mother. Vanessa scoffed loudly, saying that his mother had just humiliated him. He turned around slowly and corrected her, saying that he was the one who had humiliated his mother. It was the first completely honest statement he had made in days, and Vanessa hated it. Her entire life was built on Uthan's absolute certainty, his wealth, his corporate title, his unshakable confidence, and his ability to walk into any room and command authority. A broken Uthan terrified her far more than an angry one ever could. So she instantly shifted her tactics, claiming I had lied to him for years. She argued I had sat in that small house pretending to be a simple, helpless old woman while keeping a massive amount of power hanging directly over his head. Uthan looked over at the coffee table. The silver compass was resting there, still closed. He picked it up slowly. He read the card attached to it silently, then read it again. When the noise of success is deafening, remember where home is. Something inside him must have shifted in that exact moment, because he didn't throw it away. He opened the latch and watched the needle steady itself. North, it always pointed north. Later that evening, Tulla Johnson arrived at the penthouse carrying the formal paperwork Rukwarung Uthan's signature to finalize the temporary suspension of his duties. Uthan came very close to refusing the meeting entirely, but ultimately relented and let him in. Tulla was young, but he was far from foolish. He had worked closely enough with Uthan to have once admired him, then feared him, and now genuinely puttied him. Uthan told him coldly to just leave the documents on the table. Tulla did as he was told, but then, perhaps because he was still young enough to believe that the truth deserved to be spoken aloud, he asked if he could say something. Uthan shot him an icy glare, advising him that it was probably best if he didn't. Tulla swallowed hard but pushed forward anyway, telling Uthan that in that boardroom, his mother loved him more than anyone else in the world did. Uthan's face went completely rigid as he snapped that Tulla knew absolutely nothing about his mother. Tulla agreed that he didn't, but he knew what he had witnessed with his own eyes. He told Uthan that she had looked at him as if he were breaking her heart, but she was still doing everything she could to protect him. Uthan offered no response. Tulla continued, his voice dropping to a quiet whisper, adding that the people in the office hadn't turned their backs on Uthan because of his wealth. They had turned away because he consistently made them feel completely insignificant. Those words cut deeply into Uthan's conscience. I know this because he later confessed to me that the statement followed him into every single room of that penthouse for the rest of the night. Back in Ohio, I opened an old photo album and found a picture from Uthan's college graduation. I was standing right next to him, wearing the exact same faded coat he had recently mocked. I was smiling brighter than the sun, and he had his arm wrapped tightly around my shoulder, looking incredibly proud to have me there by his side. How do people change so completely? I used to believe that success was the thing that changed a person. Now I realize that success simply exposes the parts of them they stopped defending. Pride had crept into my son's heart very slowly, fueled by constant flattery, by wealth, and by rooms full of people who laughed at his jokes only because they wanted something from him. It was nurtured by a wife who polished his public image but never bothered to touch his soul, and by a world that constantly told him a humble background was a hurdle to overcome rather than something to honor. But I had made mistakes too. I had stayed silent for far too long. I had mistaken patience for wisdom, and I had allowed him to drift further and further away because I was terrified that pushing too hard would mean losing him entirely. Late that night, as the sun set completely behind my little house, my phone began to ring. It was Uthan. My heart stopped for a beat. I let it ring twice, then 3 times before finally picking up. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. I could hear the heavy sound of his breathing on the other end. He finally spoke, his voice cracking on a single word. "Mom." He sounded stripped of all his usual polish, entirely vulnerable and incredibly small. I answered him softly. Another heavy silence followed. I waited quietly. A part of me wanted an immediate apology. I wanted him to express deep remorse, to say all the things he should have said in that hallway. But instead, he just asked quietly if his father had really written him a letter. I closed my eyes tightly, realizing Daniel must have mentioned it to him, or perhaps a memory had finally resurfaced on its own. I told him yes. He asked if I still had it. I looked down at the yellowed envelope resting on my bed and confirmed that I did. His breath hitched slightly as he asked what it said. I picked up the envelope and pressed it close against my chest, admitting that I didn't know because I had never opened it. The silence between us changed in that instant, becoming hover and far more human. Finally, Uthan whispered that he truly didn't know who he was anymore. Tears immediately flooded my eyes. For the first time in years, my son had stopped putting on a performance. He was completely lost. And as painful as that was to hear, being lost was infinitely better than being cruel, because a person who is lost can still find their way back home. After asking about Robert's letter, Uthan didn't stay on the phone much longer that night. The silence between us stretched out so far that I briefly thought the line had cut out entirely. He told me he just needed some time, and then he hung up before I could even formulate a reply. I sat quietly on the edge of my bed, the yellowed envelope still resting in my lap. Over the years, I had pictured the moment I would hand this letter to Uthan 1,000 times. I imagined doing it at his wedding, or perhaps when he became a father himself, or at the very least, when he finally slowed down enough to ask about Robert as a real man rather than just a corporate symbol. I had never once imagined handing it over to him after he had been stripped of his title, but life rarely waits for the perfect moment to deliver the truth. Back in New York, the flawless life Uthan had constructed began to rapidly splinter all around him. The loudest voices were the very first to vanish. The men who used to clap him on the back at expensive restaurants stopped returning his calls. The investors who had always laughed the loudest at his jokes suddenly had their assistants handle his messages. The socialites Vanessa routinely entertained at the penthouse sent brief, heavily polite texts that carried a distinct, chilly distance, telling them they were keeping them in their thoughts and hoped things would quiet down soon, asking to connect once everything was resolved. Resolved, they spoke as if my son had simply become an inconvenient business disruption. Vanessa noticed the shift long before Ethan did. She had an incredibly sharp eye for social standing, able to feel a room turning cold well before anyone else would even admit the temperature had dropped. The night after the board meeting, she paced the floor of the penthouse in her silk lounge robes, clutching her phone as anger flashed across her face. She snapped that their friends were cancelling dinner plans left and right, and that people were avoiding them like the plague. Ethan sat quietly on the couch, still wearing the shirt from that morning, staring blankly at the unread corporate reports piled on the coffee table. He offered no response. Vanessa kept packing, her voice growing sharper as she complained about the sudden cancellations, furious that everyone was treating them this way. Ethan rubbed his eyes heavily and muttered that maybe they were avoiding him because it was exactly what he deserved. She stopped dead in her tracks, demanding to know what he had just said. He looked up blankly, telling her it was nothing. But she pressed him, her voice turning cutting as she warned him that if he started believing the board's narrative, they were in massive trouble. Ethan questioned what she meant by their narrative. She scoffed, saying she meant his mother's narrative, the board's narrative, and Monica's ridiculous display of victimhood. For the first time he looked at her clearly, realizing how ugly her words sounded. Perhaps they had always been that ugly, and he had simply been too blinded by his own pride to notice. He reminded her that those people had worked hard for him. Vanessa corrected him sharply, saying they worked under him and that there was a massive difference. Ethan narrowed his eyes, realizing that was the core of the problem. Vanessa threw her hands up in exasperation, mocking him for turning philosophical just because I had made him feel guilty. At the mention of my name, Ethan's gaze drifted to the coffee table. The silver compass was sitting there, wide open now, the needle pointing due north. Vanessa followed his gaze and scoffed, dismissing the item as useless junk. Ethan picked it up gently, noting that I had bought it for him well before any of this disaster had unfolded. Vanessa argued I had only bought it to manipulate him. But he shook his head, saying softly that she bought it because she still believed he was worth getting. Vanessa stared at him as if he had just committed the ultimate betrayal, asking if he was actually defending me. He replied quietly that he was simply trying to understand me. Vanessa's voice rose to a shout as she reminded him that his mother had just taken his entire company away from him. He looked at her, his eyes completely hollow and exhausted, and whispered that maybe the company had never truly belonged to him the way he thought it did. That statement completely altered the energy in the room. Vanessa's face hardened instantly, replaced not by fear, but by cold calculation. She told him slowly that if he surrendered now, he would never recover what he had lost. Ethan closed the compass with a soft click, replying that perhaps before he could even think about finding the company, he needed to figure out exactly what he had lost within himself first. She let out a sharp laugh completely devoid of humor, stating she hadn't married a man who traded his power for weak apologies. He looked at her for a long time before answering quietly that she hadn't married a man at all. She had married a corporate title. The slap came instantly. It wasn't hard enough to physically injure him, but it was sharp enough to ring through the quiet room. The moment it happened, Vanessa covered her mouth with her hand, visibly shocked by her own reaction. Ethan touched his cheek, looking more bewildered than angry. For a long moment they just stared at each other in the silence. Then Vanessa turned away abruptly. She announced she was leaving for Los Angeles, stating she needed to get away from the entire disaster. He didn't make a single move to stop her. That lack of resistance seemed to wound her pride deeper than any screaming argument ever could have. She packed 2 large suitcases that night, filling them with jewelry, shoes, and designer clothes, the things she considered absolutely essential to her existence. She left behind the framed photos from their wedding. She also left behind the small handmade bowl I had given them as a housewarming gift, something crafted by a woman from my church back home. By midnight she was gone. Ethan was left entirely alone in a penthouse that suddenly felt far less like a symbol of grand success and much more like an empty showroom after closing hours. He later confessed to me that the absolute silence was the very first thing that truly terrified him. It wasn't the board, the suspension, or even his wife walking out. It was the quiet, because in the silence there was no applause left to hide behind. He walked slowly from room to room, flicking on lights he didn't need. The expensive kitchen countertops gleamed in the dark, and the city lights flickered outside the massive windows. Everything was incredibly costly and perfectly immaculate, but absolutely nothing felt warm. Near the hallway, he noticed an old photo album sitting on a shelf. It was an album I had mailed to him years ago, right after Vanessa had complained about having too many random family items cluttering up the apartment. Ethan had never even acknowledged receiving it at the time. Now he reached up and pulled it down. The very first photograph was from his kindergarten graduation. He was wearing a paper crown and holding his certificate completely upside down. I was standing right next to him in a faded blue shirt, smiling as if he had just won a Nobel Prize. The next page showed his 10th birthday. I had baked a lopsided chocolate cake because buying a perfect one from a bakery simply wasn't an option. Ethan's face was absolutely glowing with pure joy. Then came his high school graduation, his college graduation, and his very first office job. In nearly every single photograph, I was wearing that exact same worn-out coat. The coat he had mocked. It wasn't because I had some deep affection for that piece of clothing. It was because every single time I managed to save enough money to buy something new for myself, Ethan always had a more pressing need. There were textbook fees, shoes, application costs, gas money, rent, and the suit he needed for his very first interview. Ethan sat down cross-legged right there on the floor, the album spread open across his lap. And finally, in that empty space where no one could see him, my son began to weep. It wasn't a few quiet, controlled tears. It wasn't the dignified sadness of a man trying to keep his composure. He completely fell apart, breaking down into the kind of heavy, breathless sobbing that forces you to bend double, the kind of grief that surfaces only when your memories refuse to shield you from the harm you've caused. He cried for the mother he had ridiculed. He cried for the father whose mistakes he had promised to avoid but had repeated anyway. He cried because the life he had spent years building looked incredibly grand, yet felt completely empty. At 1:17 in the morning, my phone rang again. I was wide awake. When children are lost, mothers are usually awake, even when those children have grown into adult men living in distant cities. I picked it up on the very first ring. I called his name softly. For several seconds, the only sound was his heavy breathing. Then he asked, his voice cracking instantly, if I had really walked 2 miles through the snow just to buy him that red coat. Tears welled in my eyes immediately. I realized Daniel must have shared that with him, or the memory had finally broken through. I told him quietly that I had. He choked out the words that he had forgotten. I closed my eyes and whispered that I knew he had. He shook his head, his voice heavy with emotion as he said he hadn't just forgotten, he had actively erased it. He had turned himself into someone who could look right at me and choose to see absolutely nothing. I pressed my hand tight against my chest. Even across the great distance between us, I could feel that my son was standing on the edge of a painful but entirely necessary breakthrough. I told him gently that remembering can be incredibly painful. He answered that it was exactly what he deserved. But I reminded him that deserved punishment wasn't the point. He asked what the point was then. I looked over at Robert's letter resting on the table and told him the point was what a person chooses to do after the pain clears. He went completely quiet, then he whispered that Vanessa had left. The news didn't surprise me, but I still felt a wave of sorrow for him. I told him I was truly sorry. He muttered that she had called him weak. I asked him if he believed her. Another long silence stretched out between us. He finally answered no, admitting he thought he had actually been weak for a very long time. He had just called it power. Tears ran down my cheeks. It was the very first time I heard a genuine shift in him. It wasn't a complete healing, but it was absolutely real. He asked me quietly if he could come home. My heart opened completely in that moment. It wasn't because everything was suddenly resolved, because it certainly wasn't. The apologies hadn't been spoken yet, trust hadn't been rebuilt, and the wounds were still entirely fresh, far too deep to be erased by love alone. But my son was asking to come home. He wasn't asking for his company back, and he wasn't begging for his title. He just wanted to come home. I looked around my small bedroom, taking in the old curtains, the creaking floorboards, the metal box, and the letter waiting patiently under the lamp. I told him yes, he could. I could hear his breath shake. But I added firmly that he couldn't come home just to run away from the consequences of his actions. He told me he understood. I told him he couldn't expect me to pretend that none of this had ever happened. He said he knew that. And I told him he absolutely could not return as the man who had mocked me in that ballroom. This time there was no defensiveness in his silence, only a deep, quiet humility. He whispered that he didn't want to be that man anymore. I gripped the phone tightly, telling him to drive safely, and promising I would leave the porch light on for him. After hanging up, I walked to the front door and switched on the outdoor light. Outside, the night air was cold and perfectly still. The porch railing still needed paint, and dry leaves were scattered across the steps. My house was small, old, and completely unimpressive by the standards Ethan had come to worship. But it possessed the one thing his penthouse completely lacked. It knew exactly how to welcome a broken heart without ever questioning what it was worth. Ethan arrived just before the sun began to rise. I heard the car first, the distinctive sound of tires crunching slowly over the gravel driveway, before I actually saw it. I had been sitting in the kitchen for hours, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold long before midnight. The porch light was still casting a soft, yellow glow across the front steps. For a moment, I found myself unable to move. Then I stood up, walked over to the window, and saw my son sitting behind the wheel of a black rental car. His hands were gripped tightly to the steering wheel, as if the emotional journey to get here had been far longer than the actual physical miles he had driven. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there in the dark. I understood why. Sometimes returning home is infinitely harder than walking away from it. Finally, the car door opened. Ethan stepped out into the chilly air, still wearing the clothes from the day before. His jacket was unbuttoned, his hair was messy, and his face looked completely drained from exhaustion. He looked significantly older than he had just 3 days prior, not in years, but with the sudden maturity that comes from facing the absolute truth. He looked up at the house, then looked directly at me. Before he could even knock, I opened the front door. Neither of us said a word. The crisp morning air drifted between us as the sky behind him began to turn a soft, pale blue. A few stray leaves scraped across the porch floor. He cleared his throat and managed a quiet greeting, his voice cracking instantly. I held the door open wider, telling him to come inside out of the cold. He stepped into the house slowly, almost as if he were afraid the very floorboards might reject him. His eyes scanned the living room, the old sofa, the framed graduation photos, Robert's picture resting on the mantel, the blanket draped over the arm of the chair, all the things he had once dismissed as small and unimportant. Now he looked at them as if they were vital pieces of evidence. I shut the door behind him, asking if he wanted a warm cup of coffee. He let out a weak laugh that sounded dangerously close to a sob, asking if I was really going to make him coffee after everything. I reminded him that he had just driven through the entire night. His face contorted with emotion for a second, but he quickly forced it back down, muttering that he didn't deserve it. I looked at him gently, telling him that while that might be true, he didn't deserve to be treated with cruelty either, and told him to sit down. He took a seat at the kitchen table, the exact table where he had grown up. For a few minutes I kept myself busy moving around the kitchen, simply needing something to do with my hands. I poured the hot coffee into his old blue mug, the one with the small chip on the handle, placed some toast on a plate, and set it all down right in front of him. He stared down at the mug, noting that I had kept it. He remembered making it at summer camp when he was only 9 years old, calling it ugly. I smiled faintly, agreeing that it was indeed pretty ugly. A tiny, fragile smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, before vanishing just as quickly. He lowered his head and whispered that he was deeply, truly sorry. I sat down across from him. This was the exact moment I had prayed for, yet it still brought a profound ache to my chest. He apologized for mocking me, for the way he had treated my clothes, my shoes, and my coat. He apologized for allowing Vanessa to speak to me with such condescension, and for inviting me to the gala simply because the board required a family image, rather than because he actually wanted his mother by his side. His hands shook as he gripped the mug, apologizing for making me feel small in a room where he should have been honoring me. I looked down at the table. The apology was entirely genuine, but a sincere apology alone cannot instantly erase a deep wound. I told him that an apology is a door, but it isn't the entire house. He nodded slowly, saying he understood. I asked him if he truly did. He looked up, admitting he was trying his hardest to understand. I studied his face closely. He looked like my boy again, but the innocence was completely gone. He looked like a man standing in the middle of a ruined life, trying to figure out which pieces were still worth saving. I told him I needed to ask him an important question. He replied that he would answer anything. I asked him directly what he had actually seen when he looked at me in that ballroom. He closed his eyes tightly as a wave of deep shame washed over his face. He confessed that he had seen everything he was terrified of other people finding out about him. I kept quiet, letting him speak. He forced himself to continue, admitting that he saw Ohio, the diner, the old house, and all the lean years when we barely had enough to get by. Instead of feeling a sense of deep gratitude for surviving it, he had felt completely exposed. He hated that vulnerable part of himself, so he had turned that hatred directly onto me. The truth was incredibly ugly, but it was the absolute truth nonetheless. And truth, even when it is painful to face, can serve as a foundation for a new beginning. I stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece. Robert's photograph still sat there quietly, watching over the room with a steady, peaceful presence. Right beside it lay the yellowed envelope. I picked it up. Ethan saw it and immediately froze, asking if it was his father's letter. I brought it over to the table and placed it right between us, confirming that it was. His hand reached out toward it, then hesitated. He asked quietly if his father had known he would turn out this way. I told him no, Robert hadn't known. He had simply worried that great success would test his character. Ethan swallowed hard, asking if that meant he had failed the test. I looked at him with all the love and all the pain a mother's heart could possibly hold, and told him yes, he had failed. But failure is never the final chapter, as long as you don't use pride to try and cover it up. He bowed his head. For a long time he couldn't bring himself to touch the paper. Then very carefully he picked it up and opened the envelope. I watched his eyes move across Robert's familiar handwriting. At first his face remained perfectly still. Then his lower lip began to tremble. He was reading the words silently, but I knew exactly which parts were striking his soul. Robert would have written about the necessity of humility, the dignity of hard work, the danger of getting lost in your own reflection, and surely about me, about the woman who carried far more than Ethan had ever been allowed to see. When he reached the end, Ethan pressed the letter tightly against his mouth and completely broke down. It wasn't like the heavy crying from the night before. This was a quiet, deep and shattering grief. He choked out the words, sobbing as he revealed that his father had written that if he ever grew ashamed of his mother, he should know he had already become completely bankrupt in the only way that truly mattered. Tears welled in my own eyes. Robert, even long after leaving this world, still knew exactly how to reach the places I couldn't. Ethan looked up at me, crying as he admitted he had become completely bankrupt. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his, telling him gently that he wasn't bankrupt, he was just lost. He gripped my fingers tightly, exactly the way he used to when he was a little boy crossing a busy street, begging me to tell him how to fix the damage he had done. I told him he had to take it one honest step at a time. He nodded, wiping his face quickly, and asked me to tell him what he needed to do. But I shook my head and told him no. He looked up at me, completely surprised. I explained that I wasn't going to hand him a script for redemption, because that would just turn his growth into another empty performance. His shoulders slumped heavily. I told him he needed to decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to be when there was no one left to applaud him. And then, he needed to live that way long enough for people to actually believe it. He looked around the old kitchen again, whispering that he wanted to start right here. He nodded toward the window, noting that the porch railing needed paint, the gutters were loose, and the back steps were cracked. Despite everything we had been through, a faint smile caught me off guard. I asked if he had really noticed all of that. He admitted he had noticed a lot of things the moment he walked through the door, realizing the house had needed repairs for years. He paused, then added quietly that he had needed repairs too. Those words settled deeply between us in the quiet room. After breakfast, Ethan changed into an old sweatshirt he managed to find in the hallway closet, something left over from his college days. It fit him quite tightly now. Together, we stepped outside into the crisp, cool morning air. The porch railing was in far worse shape than I cared to admit. The old white paint flaked off the moment his fingers brushed against it, and one entire section wobbled dangerously under his touch. He remarked that I should have called someone to fix it a long time ago. I replied defensively that I knew how to use a screwdriver. He looked at me, caught himself, and dropped the sharp tone entirely, replacing it with genuine concern as he said he just meant I shouldn't have had to handle all of this entirely on my own. That felt infinitely better to hear. We spent the entire morning scraping away the old, peeling paint. At first the silence between us felt incredibly heavy and awkward, but gradually it became comfortable. Ethan held the ladder steady while I cleared out the gutters, and I passed him tools as he secured the loose boards. He actually began to ask me questions, completely abandoning the arrogant pretense that he already knew everything. At one point he stopped and looked down at my hands, admitting that he used to think they just looked old. I paused my work waiting. He swallowed hard and added softly that now he realized they looked like living proof of everything I had done for him. I had to look away immediately to hide the tears in my eyes. By noon, we were both completely exhausted and covered in a fine layer of dust. I made a simple lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, the exact meal I used to prepare when money was tight. Ethan took a bite, closed his eyes, and whispered that he had missed the taste so much. I reminded him gently that he used to complain about us eating it too often. He shook his head, admitting he had been incredibly foolish. I told him he had just been young, but he corrected me, saying he had been foolish for far too long. I didn't argue with him. Late that evening, Daniel called to give me an update on the company. Ethan was sitting in the living room, quietly rereading his father's letter. Daniel informed me that the board expected a formal response from Ethan within the week. I told him Ethan was aware of the deadline. Daniel hesitated, asking if Ethan was truly being sincere this time. I looked through the doorway at my son. He was sitting directly beneath his old graduation photo, his shoulders hunched over as he held his father's letter as if it were the most fragile piece of glass in existence. I told Daniel I believed he was finally beginning to find his sincerity. After I hung up the phone, Ethan walked back into the kitchen. He announced that he needed to go back to New York. I nodded in agreement. He explained that he needed to return to apologize properly, not just to me, but to Monica, to Taylor, to the entire staff, and to all the people he had pushed out of the company over the years. I told him that was exactly what he needed to do. He added that he also needed to accept whatever final decision the board handed down. I told him that would be an excellent place to start. He looked at me, a profound mix of fear and determination visible in his eyes, as he asked if I would ever be able to forgive him. The question tugged painfully at my heart because there was no simple shortcut to an answer. I told him that I loved him and that my love had never wavered for a single second. Tears welled in his eyes again. But I continued gently, explaining that forgiveness has to grow back slowly in the exact place where trust was broken, and that trust takes a very long time to rebuild. He nodded in agreement, whispering that he would wait as long as it took. But I told him no, he shouldn't just wait, he needed to actively do the work. For the first time, a small, genuine smile touched his face as he agreed. That night, right before heading down the hall to his old bedroom, Ethan paused at the doorway and looked back at me one last time. He confessed that when he first arrived at the house, he believed he had lost his company, but now he realized he had very nearly lost his soul. I looked at him, my heart aching with a fragile sense of hope I had been terrified to feel, and told him he should be grateful he noticed the loss before it was gone forever. He nodded quietly. For the first time in many years, my son slept peacefully under my roof, not as a powerful executive hiding from public shame, but as a broken man entirely willing to start over from the beginning. 2 days later, Ethan made the journey back to New York. This time, there was no private town car arranged for his travel. He drove a modest rental sedan, packing only a single small bag, and placed Robert's letter alongside the silver compass on the passenger seat right next to him. Before pulling out of the driveway, he rolled down the window. He admitted straight out that he was terrified. I stood on the porch, wrapped in my old wool sweater, and told him that was a good thing. He blinked in surprise. I explained that fear has a way of making a person careful, whereas pride only teaches them how to bluff. He nodded slowly, taking one final look at the small house, and promised to call me the moment he arrived. I told him to drive safely. He hesitated for a second, then called out to me. I looked at him. He whispered that he knew saying sorry once would never be enough to fix what he had broken. I answered him gently, agreeing that it wouldn't be. He looked me in the eye and promised he would prove it to me. I looked at my son, truly seeing him for the first time in years. The heavy exhaustion was still visible on his face, but his eyes carried something entirely new. It wasn't the old arrogant confidence, not yet. It was something far quieter. It was accountability. I told him not to try and prove it with his words, but to prove it through the choices he made from now on. He swallowed hard, promised he would, and then drove down the road. I stood there watching until the car completely disappeared around the bend. Only then did I finally let out the breath I felt like I had been holding for days. With him gone, the house suddenly felt much larger. It wasn't an empty feeling, but rather a quiet sense of waiting, as if the very walls understood that this wasn't the conclusion of the story. It was simply the most difficult turn. Later that afternoon, Daniel called with an update. He informed me that Ethan had officially contacted the board, requesting permission to address the entire staff. I gripped the phone tightly, surprised by how quickly he was moving. Daniel confirmed it, adding that Ethan had also requested a private meeting with Monica Reed. I asked how she had responded. Daniel said she had agreed to the meeting, though she made it perfectly clear it would remain entirely professional, with no personal grievances dragged into it. I told him that was for the best. Daniel paused for a moment before asking if I was prepared for the possibility that Ethan might still fail. I looked out the kitchen window at the porch railing Ethan had helped me scrape. Half of it was freshly repaired, while the other half remained rough and weathered. I told Daniel that I was prepared for failure, but I was also entirely ready to let him try. The next morning, Ethan stood in the grand lobby of the company that bore his name, the exact space where he had publicly humiliated me just days before. But this time there were no crystal chandeliers lit up, no expensive champagne flowing, and no wealthy gala guests to impress. There were only everyday employees arriving for work, carrying travel mugs and laptop bags, their eyes filled with a mix of heavy exhaustion and cautious curiosity. Monica had deliberately arranged the meeting in the main auditorium, rather than the high-level executive boardroom. If Ethan truly intended to apologize to the people he had looked down on, he wasn't going to do it from a position of authority. He stood at the very front of the room, completely exposed without a podium. Charles sat in the front row, Daniel stood quietly against the side wall, and Monica sat with her folder closed tightly in her lap. Taylor Jensen stood near the back doors, his arms crossed, looking entirely uncertain. The seats filled up gradually. Some employees looked visibly angry, others were simply curious, and a few looked as though they had already decided that nothing he said could possibly matter. Ethan later admitted to me that facing those employees was infinitely harder than facing the board. The board had the power to strip away his title, but these people had the power to withhold their respect. As the room grew quiet, Ethan glanced down at the silver compass in his hand. He placed it gently on a small side table. He began by thanking everyone for coming, stating clearly that he owed them a massive apology. No one moved a muscle. He took a deep, steady breath. He addressed the gala directly, stating that he had publicly humiliated his mother in front of many of them. He declared that there was absolutely no excuse for the words he used or the way he had behaved. A few employees exchanged quiet glances. Ethan's voice shook slightly, but remained perfectly clear as he confessed he had called it a joke only because he was too cowardly to admit it was an act of pure cruelty. Monica looked up at him, and Taylor lowered his eyes. He continued, stating that his mother, Leela Alexander, had sacrificed far more for his life than he ever deserved, yet he had mocked the marks of those sacrifices simply because he had grown ashamed of where he came from. The auditorium was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on his words, though the listening didn't mean they were ready to forgive. Ethan explained that the shame hadn't started or ended with his mother. He had brought that toxic attitude directly into the company, pushing out veteran employees because he viewed them as outdated, valuing appearances over genuine wisdom, and mistaking fear for respect. He confessed he had routinely rewarded flattery while ignoring the people who dared to challenge him, admitting plainly that he had caused real harm within those walls. A woman in the third row wiped a tear from her eye, and an older man sitting near the aisle stared intently at the floor. Ethan turned his gaze directly to Monica, apologizing for treating her accountability as an act of betrayal when she had raised concerns he should have listened to. Monica offered a single, dignified nod of acknowledgement. Then he looked toward the back of the room, apologizing to Taylor for forcing him into a position where loyalty meant staying silent, labeling the action completely wrong. Taylor clenched his jaw tightly, but offered a nod of his own. Ethan folded his hands in front of him, stating he accepted his suspension completely and would cooperate fully with the board's review. He assured them he wasn't asking anyone to protect him, forgive him, or trust him until he had actually earned that trust through his actions. Those words seemed to shift the heavy energy in the room. It didn't fix everything, but it absolutely broke the tension. Then he delivered the statement that mattered most. He promised that if he ever returned to a position of leadership, it would never be because his last name was printed on the front of the building. It would be because he had finally learned how to respect every single person inside it. When he finished speaking, nobody clapped. And that was exactly how it should have been. A real apology doesn't deserve applause as if it were a theatrical performance. The employee simply sat with the weight of his words in the quiet room. Then Charles stood up. He announced that the company would immediately launch an internal culture assessment, promising that employees could speak completely openly without any fear of retaliation, and assuring them the board would be listening closely. That announcement brought something infinitely better than applause, a collective sense of relief. Over the course of the following week, Ethan did exactly what I told him he needed to do. He worked, not as a powerful CEO issuing commands, but as a man trying to understand the actual human cost of the commands he had already given. He sat down individually with the employees who had filed complaints against him. When some refused to meet with him entirely, he accepted their decision without argument. When others agreed to see him, they didn't hold back their anger. A veteran project manager named Harold Pierce looked him in the eye and told him he had made him feel like 32 years of loyal service had a strict expiration date. Ethan didn't offer a single excuse, he simply wrote the words down in his notepad. A woman from the finance department told him she had stopped speaking up in meetings entirely because the one time she questioned an exorbitant luxury marketing expense, he had laughed at her. He apologized sincerely, but she told him plainly that she didn't need an apology. She needed him to ensure he never treated another woman in the company that way again. He wrote that down too. Monica handed him the exit interview records of the employees who had been forced out during his tenure, demanding he review them. He read every single one. By the third file, the weight of it forced him to leave the room to catch his breath. By the fifth, he returned and kept reading. It was painful, but it was absolutely necessary. 4 days later, Vanessa returned from Lowe's Angels. She had clearly assumed Ethan would be desperate to win her back, but he wasn't. She walked into the penthouse wearing dark sunglasses and carrying shopping bags, fully prepared to resume the lifestyle she understood. Instead, she found Ethan sitting at the dining table, completely surrounded by employee reports. Robert's letter was resting beside him, and the compass was open near his hand. She scoffed, asking if he was still performing this guilt-driven drama. He looked up calmly, telling her it wasn't a performance. She laughed sharply, claiming that everything in life is a performance and that he had simply forgotten how to control the audience. He stared at her for a long time, realizing with sudden clarity that was truly how she viewed human beings. Vanessa rolled her eyes, stating that was simply how the world worked. But Ethan shook his head, replying softly that attitude was exactly why they had both become so completely empty inside. Her expression darkened instantly as she questioned his use of the word we. He looked at her steadily and confirmed that he meant both of them. The argument lasted less than 20 minutes, but it effectively brought an end to a marriage that had been fractured long before either of them had the courage to admit it. Vanessa accused him of choosing public humiliation over real power, while Ethan told her he was simply choosing the absolute truth over a lifetime of pretense. She walked out again that night. This time he didn't stand by the window to watch her car leave. He simply sat back down at the table and went back to his reading. Meanwhile, I remained in Ohio, waiting. Waiting is perhaps the oldest duty of a mother. We wait for their very first steps, we wait for late-night phone calls, we wait for exam results, we wait for apologies, and we wait for healing to begin. We wait through anger, through silence, and through hope, even when that hope terrifies us because we know it carries the potential to hurt. Ethan called me every single evening. The conversations weren't long, but they were entirely honest. He shared everything with me, his meetings with Harold Pierce, the finance director, Taylor, and Monica, as well as Vanessa's final departure. One evening, he confessed quietly that he believed he had loved the grand image. She helped create for him far more than he had ever loved the actual reality of being together. I closed my eyes, acknowledging that realizing such a truth is incredibly painful. He agreed, nodding it was entirely necessary. On another night, he asked me out of nowhere if I thought his father would hate him for what he had done. I answered him instantly without a shred of doubt, telling him that while Robert would be deeply disappointed and likely furious, there was absolutely no hatred in his heart. Ethan murmured that he was deeply disappointed in himself. I told him to let that disappointment serve as his teacher. At the end of the month, the board officially handed down its decision. Ethan would not be returning to his role as CEO, not yet. Instead, Charles would step in as the temporary executive chairman, and Monica would lead a newly formed committee focused on cultural recovery. Ethan would be placed into a strictly supervised advisory role, completely stripped of any direct authority over personnel or corporate spending for an entire year. A full year. When Daniel broke the news to me, I waited for the part of my heart that functions as a protective mother to ache with sorrow. It did, but the wiser, grounded part of me understood that the decision was entirely fair. Ethan called me that night, stating simply that he had accepted the terms. I asked him if he was angry about it. He admitted he felt a little anger. I let out a sad, gentle laugh, commending his honesty, but reminding him that we both knew the decision was right. This was already infinitely better. Then he added quietly that he had asked the company to remove his large portrait from the main lobby. I was genuinely surprised, asking him why. He explained that he didn't want people walking into the building and seeing one man's face displayed, as if he had built the entire legacy completely on his own. My throat tightened with emotion as I asked what would take its place. He paused for a moment before explaining that they would display photos of the very first small office, the early employees, his father, and if I would allow it, a photo of me. I looked over at Robert's photograph on the mantelpiece. For years, I had hidden entirely behind the corporate shield because I truly believed my silence was protecting my son. Now, my son was demanding that the foundation of truth be made entirely visible to the world. I told him I would think about it. He let out a quiet, gentle laugh, recognizing that as my way of offering a temporary delay. I smiled, reiterating that it simply meant I would think about it. He relented softly. His voice carried a quality I hadn't heard in years, deep respect. It wasn't born of fear or desperation, it was genuine respect. After we hung up, I looked out the window at the porch railing that was still only half painted. The work wasn't finished, but the first layer of fresh white paint had dried perfectly smooth. Sometimes a repair looks incredibly rough before it ever becomes beautiful. Sometimes a family has to completely scrape away the old, damaged layers, expose the wounds underneath, sand down all the rough edges and start over with patient hands. Ethan wasn't completely healed yet, and neither was I. But for the first time in a very long time, we had entirely stopped pretending the damage didn't exist, and that honesty made real healing possible. 1 year later, I found myself standing once again in the main lobby of Alexander Global Solutions. This time there was absolutely no embarrassment. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft, familiar hum. For a brief moment, I just stood there on the threshold, letting the memory of that terrible evening pass completely through me without leaving a shadow of pain behind. The lobby itself looked identical in many ways, the immaculate polished floors, the towering ceilings, and the bright sunlight streaming through the massive windows, but one crucial feature had changed completely. The wall directly behind the main reception desk no longer featured the grand portrait of Uthan. Instead, it displayed a long, beautifully framed sequence of photographs. There was the first tiny office space, fat young Robert standing proudly next to a rented desk, followed by pictures of the early staff members with their sleeves rolled up, working hard. And right there was a photo of a young version of myself sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by corporate papers, one hand holding a pen while the other rested near a coffee mug. I had completely forgotten that Daniel had ever taken that picture. Directly beneath the display hung a small, elegant plaque with a simple inscription: "Legacies are built by the people who make silent sacrifices when no one is watching." I traced the raised letters gently with trembling fingers. Uthan stood quietly by my side. He looked noticeably different now. He was still entirely handsome and impeccably dressed, but the sharp, rigid edge that used to make him seem intimidating had been replaced by a much softer, grounded presence. Humility hadn't made him small, it had simply made him human again. He looked at the wall, asking quietly if I thought the display was too much. I looked at him and assured him it wasn't. His shoulders relaxed instantly as he explained he wanted everyone who entered to know the absolute truth, not just about who owned the company, but exactly where its heart came from. I turned to face him, asking if he finally understood where it came from himself. He looked directly at the photograph of his father, and answered quietly that it came from love, hard work, vulnerability, hope, and from the people who consistently gave far more to the legacy than they ever took from it. A wave of deep emotion caught in my throat. Later that morning, the company held a small, private gathering for the staff. There was no lavish banquet arranged, no towering crystal chandeliers, no champagne fountains, and no media reporters invited to polish anyone's public image. There were only the employees, the ones who had stayed through the turmoil, the ones who had chosen to return, and the ones who had been deeply hurt, but were still deciding whether it was safe to offer their trust once again. Charles Watmer spoke first, officially announcing that the company had successfully completed its Cultural Recovery initiative. He shared that retirement protections had been fully restored, vendor review policies had been thoroughly revised, and a brand new Employee Dignity Oversight Committee had been established under Monica Reed's leadership. Then Monica took the stage. She didn't offer Uthan any easy praise, and I respected her deeply for that restraint. She stated plainly that real healing isn't proven by a single speech, It is proven over time by a consistent pattern of behavior. She noted that over the past year, the company had finally begun to see that better pattern emerge. Uthan sat quietly in the front row, his hands folded in his lap as he listened intently. There was no defensiveness left in his posture, no hint of a performance. When it was his turn to address the room, he walked to the front without a single note in his hands. He began by admitting that he used to believe leadership was entirely about being admired by others. But when he lost that admiration, he was forced to look inward and question whether anything of actual value remained beneath the title. The entire room fell perfectly silent. He turned his eyes toward me. He credited his mother with showing him the answer, not by stepping in to save him from his mistakes, but by firmly refusing to allow him to continue down a path of cruelty. Tears blurred my vision completely. He concluded by stating he could never undo the damage he had caused in the past, but he could absolutely choose to spend the rest of his life unshung. He never repeated those mistakes again. With that, he stepped away from the microphone. There was no sudden, dramatic burst of applause. Instead, the room responded with a quiet, deeply sincere standing ovation. It began slowly, with one person standing, then another, until the entire room was on its feet. Tulla was the very first to stand, followed by Harold Pierce, then the woman from the finance department, then Monica, and finally Charles. I sat in my seat for a long moment, completely overwhelmed by the sight before me. My son was no longer receiving blind corporate adulation, he was receiving earned respect. And then I stood up to join them. Uthan saw me, and he lowered his head in quiet gratitude. After the gathering concluded, he walked me through the building, introducing me to the staff members we passed along the way. He didn't introduce me as a corporate symbol or a marketing image, he introduced me simply as his mother. He introduced me to everyone as Leela Alexander, his mother, and one of the primary reasons the company existed at all. Every single introduction felt like the quiet healing of a tiny, lingering wound. Not all of them were gone, but it was more than enough. Later that week, we traveled back to Ohio together. Uthan insisted on finishing the paint job on the porch railing, and I told him the tools were waiting for him. He laughed warmly, stating that was perfect because he was ready too. That afternoon, under a clear, warm spring sky, my son stood on my front porch wearing old jeans and a faded sweatshirt, applying a fresh coat of bright white paint to the weathered wood. I sat nearby in a chair, quietly shelling peas into a ceramic bowl. I called out to him, teasing that he had missed a spot. He turned around, pretending to be deeply offended, laughing as he reminded me that he was a former CEO and clearly still a terrible painter. He let out a genuine laugh, the exact laugh I remembered from his childhood, before life had taught him to prioritize pleasing total strangers over honoring the people who loved him. Once the railing was finished, he sat down next to me on the porch steps. For a long while neither of us said a word. The sun began to dip slowly behind the trees, and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog echoed through the quiet afternoon. The house looked small and old but incredibly beautiful. Uthan reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver compass. The metal casing had become slightly worn over the past year from being opened so frequently. He remarked quietly that he brought it with him everywhere he went. I smiled, telling him I knew he did. He laughed softly, agreeing that of course I knew. The needle trembled for a moment before locking firmly onto north. He confessed that he used to believe home was just a place a person grows up and leaves behind, but now he realized home is a place you have to truly deserve before you can ever really return to it. I looked at him gently, telling him he had always been allowed to return. He added quietly that a person must deserve to stay. He nodded, stating he was still working on that part. I confessed to him that I was working on it too. He looked up at me in surprise. I explained that I had to learn as well. I had to learn that loving him didn't mean shielding him from the reality of his own choices. Sometimes, real love requires standing back and letting the truth do its necessary work. His expression softened completely, as he whispered that he was incredibly grateful I had found the strength to do so. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers wrapped tightly around mine, exactly the way they used to when he was a little boy crossing a busy street, trusting completely that I would lead him safely to the other side. Only now we were both much older, completely changed and both still learning how to navigate the road. After dinner that evening, Uthan handled the dishes while I dried. He didn't offer a single complaint about the old plumbing or the creaking floorboards, and he didn't check his phone once. He just rolled up his sleeves and stood right beside me, handling an everyday chore in a modest kitchen. In a strange way, that simple moment felt like the greatest miracle of all. Right before he stepped out the door to head back, he paused on the threshold and turned to look at me. He told me he loved me. It wasn't a rushed, mechanical statement, and it wasn't spoken out of a sense of lingering guilt. The words came from his heart like a true promise. I looked at him and told him I loved him too. He pulled me into a deep, tight embrace, not a cautious or polite hug, but a real, fiercely loving hold. It was the embrace of a son who had finally remembered that his mother wasn't just a piece of his past. She was the entire reason he had a future worth living. After his car pulled away down the dark road, I stood on the porch for a few minutes, watching the fresh white paint on the railing gleam softly under the moonlight. For many years, I believed that justice would mean proving my son completely wrong, but standing there in the quiet night, it didn't feel that way at all. Real justice simply felt like watching him finally discover the right direction again. And healing doesn't happen all at once in a grand, dramatic moment. It reveals itself in the smallest details, in a sincere apology, a repaired front porch, a company that chooses human dignity over profit, and a son who looks at his mother's worn-out clothes and finally sees the profound love woven into every single stitch. Sometimes, the people we love the most can easily forget the heavy price paid for the life they enjoy. They look at the surface and see old clothes, exhausted hands, a simple home and silent sacrifices, but they miss the years of deep love anchors beneath it all. Lee's story serves as a vital reminder that true dignity never comes from expensive suits, high-level corporate titles, or gleaming skyscrapers. Real dignity comes from a place of deep gratitude, and from remembering exactly who stood by our side well before the rest of the world ever bothered to learn our name. A mother's love can be incredibly patient, but it should never be mistaken for weakness. True love knows how to forgive, but it must never enable cruelty. Sometimes, the absolute strongest thing a parent can do is to step out of the way and stop rescuing their adult children from the reality of their own actions. Ethan didn't find healing because he managed to cling to his corporate power. He found healing because he lost the dangerous illusion that power made him superior to others. He had to experience a hard fall before he could finally remember the strength of the hands that had lifted him up in the first place. If this story touched your heart tonight, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Lee made the right choice by letting Ethan face the full consequences of his behavior? Have you ever witnessed someone genuinely change after life brought them down to earth? Please leave a like on the video, subscribe for more moving family stories, and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single comment, and your personal stories mean more than you know.